Okay, so I'm going to present on Kierkegaard and Hegel on the modal categories, and I'm going to use this adorable little whiteboard, old-fashioned paperboard to kind of write some keywords and the basic structure of the argument, because I know it's very early in the morning for Hegel. Okay. So in the philosophical fragments in the interlude, Johannes Climacus asks the question, is the past necessary? Meaning, once possibility becomes actuality, does that actuality also become necessity? So is the past necessary? I hope that this will be basically big enough for us to see. Once possibility becomes actuality, does that actuality also become necessity? Now, Climacus is responding to a lot of different philosophers in the fragments, but I'm going to focus mainly on Hegel, because he's definitely responding, at least in part, to Hegel on this question. Climacus claims that for Hegel, the past is necessary. Once possibility becomes actuality, that actuality is also necessity for Hegel. So I want to go through Hegel's basic modal categories to figure out where he may have said this, why Climacus can attribute this to Hegel, and then I'm going to go through Climacus's basic critique. I'm going to argue somewhat counterintuitively that Climacus doesn't necessarily disagree with Hegel that the past is necessary in Hegel's two basic senses that we'll talk about. It's more that for Climacus, he doesn't really care if the past is necessary in Hegel's sense. He wants to claim that we can't really know that the past is necessary in any meaningful sense. So he seems like he's going to agree with Hegel, but he's going to say, but it doesn't really matter because we can't know the past is necessary in any truly meaningful sense. Okay, so Hegel. We're going to do our 5 to 10 minute Hegel here. Hegel on the modal categories. So Hegel says if we're going to talk about actuality, we first have to talk about possibility, because actuality starts out as possible. So possibility. And here I'm drawing on Hegel's discussion in the science of logic, which is incredibly complex. He goes through formal modality, real modality, and absolute modality. I'm going to crunch it down into just the basics that I think Climacus is actually really engaging with. So possibility. Hegel says the first way we try to define possibility is pretty abstract. We define it in terms of what he calls formal possibility. I'm going to abbreviate here. Formal possibility. The first way we describe the category of possibility, we say, well, the possible is anything that I can think, mere thinkability. Anything that I can conceive or imagine in thought, and I can conceive or imagine in thought anything whatsoever, as long as it's not self-contradictory. So formal possibility means anything we can think, and we can think anything that is not self-contradictory. I'm definitely going to run out of room, but we'll make it work. So the first way we define possibility is pretty basic. Anything that I can think. Anything that I can think, something that's not self-contradictory. So if A is not self-contradictory, I can think A. Of course, that doesn't mean that A actually exists in reality. It just means that I can think it. It's logically possible. Okay? But Hegel says, but the more we think about this, the more we realize that this definition of possibility breaks down into what he calls mere possibility. Because if I can think A without contradiction, I can also think its opposite, not A, without contradiction. So any possibility that I can think, its opposite possibility is equally thinkable, therefore equally merely possible. So mere possibility means both the one possibility and its opposite are possible. For any possibility that I can think without contradiction, its opposite possibility is equally thinkable, therefore equally merely possible. So since both A and not A are equally thinkable, equally merely possible, that means we don't know whether or not A will become actual or not A will become actual. I don't know if the one possibility will become actual or the other possibility will become actual. Both are merely possible. So we don't know whether it's going to be the one or the other that becomes actual. Okay, I guess I'm going to have to flip this, but we can always flip that. So because formal possibility breaks down into mere possibility, both A and not A are equally thinkable, therefore equally merely possible. I don't know if it will be A or not A that becomes actual. Hegel says we need a better definition of possibility. So that brings us to what he calls real possibility. He says, okay, we don't actually want to know if something is just merely thinkable, merely logically possible. We want to know if something is really possible. Can it become actual in the concrete world? So real possibility is now more about actual possibility that can become actual, or it's likely to become actual in the concrete world. And he says a real possibility has to involve the conditions of reality. Not just what I can think without contradiction, but it has to make sense with the general conditions of reality. So a real possibility for Hegel, he says, is the complete set of conditions needed for a given possibility to become actual. If something is really possible for Hegel, that means all of the conditions needed to actualize that possibility exist together in reality. For something to be really possible, all of the requisite conditions have to exist simultaneously in reality. So for A to be really possible, imagine that conditions B, C, and D have to exist in reality for A to be really possible. Then all three of those conditions, B, C, and D, all have to exist together simultaneously for A to be really possible. Okay. Maybe you can help me keep an eye on time.
Okay.
Okay, so that's going to move us to actuality. So a better definition of possibility is all of the conditions needed to actualize it exist in reality. That is really possible. And Hegel says, but if something is really possible, if all of the conditions needed to actualize it exist in reality, then that possibility necessarily becomes actuality. So a real possibility is always already a real actuality. Because if all the conditions exist to actualize this possibility, it can't help but become actual. It's already actual. Okay? So he now moves to actuality, and he's going to define this actuality as necessity in two different ways. So actuality is necessity in two ways. One, for Hegel, he says, this actuality that results from a real possibility is necessary because it had to be. This possibility had to become actual. Its contrary possibility could not have become actual. Because if we have a real possibility, if all of the conditions needed to actualize it exist in reality, it has to become actual. Its opposite cannot become actual. So it could not have been otherwise. Its opposite could not have been. And two, we can describe this actuality as necessity because it has to be. It can't become different. Once one of the two possibilities becomes actual, the contrary possibility can't become actual in its place. It's already over, it's already done with. Once A becomes actual, A is actual. You can't all of a sudden say, well, now not A is actual. No, once one becomes actual, it has to be. You can't change it, you can't undo it. So I think that this is where Climacus is talking about the past in Hegel. A past actuality is necessity because it had to be, it could not have been otherwise, and it has to be, it can't now be otherwise. The other possibility could not have come into existence, and the other possibility cannot now come into existence. Okay, I hope that was reasonably clear. Moving on to Climacus. Done with Hegel. So Climacus, I'm going to argue, would say that Hegel is not wrong, that a past actuality is necessary, in the sense that it had to be, and it has to be. I think Climacus is arguing more that, well, even if Hegel is right, it doesn't really matter, because we cannot know the past as necessary. So his main critique is that we cannot know the past as necessary. As we'll see, he's going to say the past isn't really necessary for us. We can't know that in a meaningful way. Yeah, we can kind of basically know it in the logical, abstract way that Hegel describes, but we don't know that it's necessary in any meaningful, existential way. Okay, so before we can figure out why he says this, we have to begin, as we did with Hegel, Climacus's view of possibility. Okay. The possible is possible for Climacus in two ways. Both the what and the how of possibility are possible for Hegel, or for Climacus. I don't think that Climacus would disagree with Hegel that the what of possibility is possible. That seems pretty basic. I think we all agree. We don't know what's going to come into existence. Is it going to be A or not A? Because both of those are merely possible. Okay? But he also claims that possibility is possible in the sense of the how. He repeatedly uses the phrase possible how and multiple possible how in the interlude. So he's saying, not only can we not know what's going to happen, but we also can't know how that is going to happen. He's saying that there are multiple possible ways a given possibility can come into existence. Or we can say multiple possible sets of conditions. So not only do we not know whether A or not A is going to come into existence, but we also don't know how A might come into existence or how not A might come into existence. So we don't know the what or the how. All we can say is one of the two possibilities is going to become actual, and it's going to become actual in this way or this other way or that other way. So if I give a kind of concrete example to illustrate this, so imagine the possibility of somebody getting a new job. Okay, let's imagine that they get that job. That job could come into existence through multiple possible hows. Maybe they get that job because they were the best candidate. Or maybe they get that job because no one else applied. Or maybe they get that job because there was some sort of corruption or favoritism on the part of the search committee. There are multiple ways that person could get that job. All right. How are we doing on time?
Like 8 minutes.
Oh, 8 minutes,
10
okay.
minutes.
All right, I will go really quickly. So basically what Climacus is saying is that the possible is even more possible than Hegel says. He adds another dimension of possibility. He adds another level of uncertainty to possibility. This will become important in a little bit. Okay, so now let's go to his basic critiques. I'm going to try to speed through. First, let's attack Hegel's view that the past actuality had to be. It had to come into existence. The opposite could not have come into existence. I don't think that Climacus disagrees with this, or at least he shouldn't disagree with this. Because Hegel's view of necessity here is pretty weak. He's not saying that something had to come into existence from the beginning of time. He's just saying, relative to the conditions that existed, it had to come into existence. Since all of the conditions were in place for that possibility to become actual, it had to become actual. But those conditions could have been different. Hegel doesn't say the conditions were destined to be that way. Had the conditions have been different, then a different actuality would have to have followed. So I think that for Hegel, this is actually a pretty weak form of necessity, and I don't think it's anything that Climacus should necessarily disagree with. What he does disagree with is he's going to say, sure, we can say that the past had to be, but we cannot really know that it had to be. Yeah, we can know kind of logically, basically, if something came into existence, all of the conditions needed to bring it into existence must have existed. But we can't really know meaningfully that it had to be, because we can never reconstruct the exact set of conditions that led to that actuality. We can never reconstruct the real possibility that Hegel talks about. There's no way we could ever reconstruct all of the conditions. And so if we can't reconstruct all of the conditions that led to a certain actuality, we can't really know that it had to be, because we can't see that necessary connection. We can't see the necessary connection between the possibility and the actuality, the conditions and the result. Okay, I'm going to just kind of leave that. I have more to say, but if you want to ask me during Q&A, yeah. Okay. Let's move to this one, because I think it's a little bit more interesting. This idea that the actual has to be. It cannot be changed. Again, I don't think that Climacus should disagree with this. That seems pretty basic. Once the possibility becomes actual, you can't change it. You can't act as though it didn't happen. It happened. And I think that Climacus would say, yeah, on some basic level, we can know that this is necessary. We tend to know what basic actuality came into existence. I know whether it was A or not A that came into existence. I know the basic result. But Climacus is going to say, knowing what happened doesn't just mean knowing the basic what. This possibility became actual. This basic fact. For him, knowing what happened requires knowing the meaning of what happened. We need to know the meaning, the significance of what basic outcome came to be. And Climacus is going to say, the only way you can know the meaning of something is to know how it came into existence. This makes a lot of sense to me. Because if we ask someone, oh, what happened? We ask them something about a past actuality. Oh, tell me what happened. We're not asking them to tell us just the bare outcome. We want them to tell us how that outcome came to be, right? So if you think like a forest fire started. Okay, we know basically what happened. There was a forest fire. But we don't want to know just that there was a forest fire. We want to know, how did that forest fire come into existence? And how it came into existence seems to impact the meaning. Imagine it came into existence kind of naturally because of hot and dry conditions. Or imagine that it came into existence accidentally because someone forgot to extinguish a campfire. Or imagine it came into existence on purpose because of arson or something like that. What happened? The meaning of what happened, that forest fire, seems to change depending on how it came into existence. It seems to depend on which of the multiple possible how brought it into existence. Or if we think of like someone tells you that they're getting married, you go, oh, that's great. What's your next question? How did you meet? How did you fall in love? We want to know the how leading up to the what. Because I think we have this instinctive belief that how something came to be impacts what that something is. The how impacts the what. Okay. But in order to really know the meaning of what happened, we have to know the how. But we set up here for Climacus that we can't ever know how something came to be. We can never reconstruct all the conditions. So if we can't know the how, then we can't ever really know the what. And so for Climacus, I think at the end of the day, he almost wants to claim that the past is contingent and not necessary. Not in an absolute logical sense, but for us. I can never really know exactly how something came into existence. So if I can never know exactly how something came into existence, I can't really know what it means, what it is. So the past is left contingent, meaning I don't really know what happened because I don't know the conditions that brought it into existence. The past is left open-ended. And this makes some sense. This is why historians keep looking for the causes of things, because they want to know exactly how did this thing come into existence, so that I can know exactly what it was. If we learn new information about how something came into existence, we tend to reform our understanding of what that something is. So if I think that I was hired because I was the best candidate, I have one sense of what happened. But if I learn 10 years from now, like, oh no, there was a lot of infighting in the committee, and there was a lot of like corruption and favoritism, and you didn't completely get hired on your qualifications, what happened seems to change. The past is not fixed. It's not the case that it has to be. It can be otherwise. So I'm going to kind of leave it there. I'm working towards how this is all going to bring to conclusion a basic understanding of the fragments, especially in the interlude when he talks about that we cannot really understand the past. We have to approach it through wonder and belief. But I don't want to run into the other panelists' time, so I will leave it there.
Hello. Thank you, Erin, for having me and for organizing all this. It's been a lovely conference so far, so let's hope for the best today and tomorrow. I will jump right into the paper. It is basically a commentary on the concept of anxiety. It's partly exegetic, so to speak, but my main goal is to present is to make a differentiation between what I would say is education and what is the upbuilding in Kierkegaard, at least as showcased by the concept of anxiety. To put it differently, what I'm trying to do here is found it on one single sentence from the concept of anxiety, or as a commentary on this sentence. So let's have it first. Anxiety is freedom's possibility, and only such anxiety is, through faith, absolutely educative, because it consumes all finite ends and discovers all their deceptiveness. So this is a pretty well-known sentence from chapter 5 of the concept of anxiety, from the final concluding chapter. And my concern here will be to start with the idea of what education is in this sentence, so that Hoffmanians can say that anxiety is, through faith, absolutely educative. Now, I'm really sorry, I prefer not to have a Danish audience, because if I don't, then maybe I would try to say the words, but like this, always absolutely stressed. Kierkegaard uses the word dennos as education, and here he says denende. So what is the education? That's my first concern. Secondly, what role does anxiety have in the education? And thirdly, and that's obviously the topic of the conference, how is anxiety through faith absolutely educative in the sense of freedom's possibility? So what is the possibility of this education, or of this problem? Okay, so I will start by asking a question that, at least for me, is quite interesting, and that's we know that the pseudonym Vigilius Hoffnensis came in Kierkegaard's thought almost as an afterthought. He originally thought that he would publish the concept of anxiety under his own name, but then he changed his mind. The question is, wouldn't it almost suggest that the concept of anxiety was somehow supposed to be an upbuilding discourse? Because at that time, what he published under his own name were the upbuilding discourses. So would it be interesting to take a look at the concept of anxiety as basically an upbuilding discourse, or what would qualify it as an upbuilding discourse and what would not? Well, the concept of anxiety clearly represents a different style or authorial strategy than the upbuilding discourses published parallel with the pseudonymous works. Johannes Climacus, in the famous look at the contemporary Danish literature, at his own works obviously, at Kierkegaard's works, says that the concept of anxiety is somewhat didactic, Dozerende, whatever it's pronounced like, I'm sorry really. Perhaps because its task consists of, and I quote, communication of knowledge that takes place before a transition could be made to inward deepening. So the role of the concept of anxiety almost reminds one of an informational leaflet in a way. It is almost like an informed consent form to be signed before the operation begins. At least that's the idea in Johannes Climacus. Vigilius Hoffniensis does not seem to edify his reader inasmuch as the essence and scope of edification seems to be to elevate and console. Hoffniensis seems to be more interested in anxiety, obviously. Yet again, anxiety does in fact provide consolation of sorts. I quote, "He who passes through the anxiety of the possible is educated to have no anxiety, not because he can escape the terrible things of life, but because these always become weak by comparison with those of possibility." So that's not only consolation. Anxiety is also terrifying. Terrifying in the sense of upbuilding. Because what exactly is the upbuilding? The first answer to this, and this is Kierkegaard in the Christian discourses a few years later. So what exactly is the upbuilding? The first answer to this is that the upbuilding is at first the terrifying. It would seem that by design the concept of anxiety represents the upbuilding qualities of being both terrifying as well as consolatory in a way. One needs to learn anxiety, or one needs to allow anxiety to, as Hoffniensis says, to almost ransack everything. Learn to love it as a serving spirit. What then are we to make of the concept of anxiety? How does it relate to the upbuilding discourses, and what place does it have among the pseudonymous production? In chapter 5, titled Anxiety as Saving Through Faith, Hoffniensis employs a new concept of anxiety. Upon close reading, one realizes that in chapter 5, Hoffniensis suddenly identifies anxiety with education, Danielson. For Hoffniensis, education involves formation, or rather transformation of the individual. Very much like in the Grimm's fairy tale, one needs to learn fear, albeit not fear as fear of something concrete and external, but anxiety which one produces oneself. So learning how to be anxious in the right way is the ultimate, in Hoffniensis' words. And only such anxiety is through faith absolutely educative, which we have to see in what sense, but that's the claim. Now, this should in fact strike us as unusual. What's unusual about this is that Hoffniensis basically remains silent about education in the earlier 4 chapters of the book. And Kierkegaard, Kierkegaard the author, shies away from the concept of education in his other works, at least in the works up to the concept of anxiety. Kierkegaard's critique aims exactly at those educated, or cultivated, as he would maybe understand, civilized almost. Education and culture seem to be impediments and obstacles of Christianity, in his view. Or in Climacus's words, I quote, as understanding and culture and refinement increase, sustaining the passion of faith becomes more difficult. Kierkegaard advocates against this refinement, or against this cultured education, against this apparent cultural philisterai. He also strongly dislikes the notion of education as drill, which is nothing more than a mask which hides the inner emptiness and which closes itself off from the human element, making one just a machine-like husk. So Hoffniensis understands anxiety's education differently. It is not about this kind of cultured education. It is not about this kind of drill. The Danish word Dannelse is a loan from German. It is a calque, a translation of the word Bildung, and it is more than that. It is a loan of the concept of education, of Bildung as formative education, in the tradition of German Romanticism. It is personal formation or self-cultivation. Cultivation in the sense of shaping, building oneself. However, this notion of education is exactly burdened by the romantic tradition of poetic production. Education in this sense relates to the individuality of the educated as a work of art, almost, as something to be created, something to be freely constructed and completed. Education in the concept of anxiety hardly resembles poetic production. Rather, it takes the form of original experience. To be educated means to experience something originally, as in, and now I'm quoting from, again, a bit later work from the Literary Review, to be educated is something as in a maidservant genuinely in love is essentially educated, cultured, dened. Which is to say that education relates to primitive experience. This conception of education taken from the Literary Review strongly resembles the view of Hoffman's, where it is again about relating to the original, relating to the true experience, to the experience unveiled by culture, as I will argue. Now, I wouldn't even hesitate to understand the concept of anxiety as a study of how we, or how, well, humanity relates to sin and its transformations. This is important because the goal of the book, from my perspective, from this point of view that I'm presenting, would be to reacquire a primitive relationship to sin. So the book would be about reaching back to the original instead of going somewhere further. So this is particularly obvious in chapter 3 of the concept of anxiety, where most readers focus on the first part, on the famous discussion of the instant and the analysis of the time-eternity synthesis of man. But the focus of the chapter lies somewhere else. It's in the 3 paragraphs that follow after this introduction. Hoffman's in the three paragraphs studies different ways in which individuals react to their sinfulness. And he studies ways of how we avoid confrontation with the consciousness of sinfulness. So the 3 main forms of this avoidance are spiritlessness, fate, or the Greek standpoint, and guilt, the Jewish standpoint. So the 3 reactions are basically false representations. They are appearances of truth which need to be overcome and set aside. What I mean is that because of anxiety, because of this pressure, because of this kind of looming consciousness of sin, in Kierkegaard's interpretation, fate or guilt are devised to avoid the confrontation, to make it possible to concentrate on something else, to not really confront oneself with sinfulness. So we then have these surrogate kind of inventions which we believe to be true standpoint, the standpoint of fate as giving us some real understanding of the world, or guilt as founding a moral relationship to God. But in Kierkegaard's view, those are false standpoints. So these then need to be overcome and set aside from the Christian point of view. Now it's really interesting that we should really notice the title of the chapter, of chapter 3, because the title is very long, but and it's really difficult to understand the title of the chapter given what he talks about in the case of temporality, eternity and such. But it makes perfect sense when we think about this idea of repressing the consciousness of sin. The title is Anxiety as the Consequence of That Sin, which is absence of the consciousness of sin. So in the absence of the consciousness of sin, we sin by repressing it even further, by devoting ourselves to these other ways of understanding the world and such. So based on such deliberation, I am convinced that what we have in the concept of anxiety is a study of the development and constitution of consciousness, of sin. The education of anxiety points to the fundamental, to the primitive, or to the original experience. More precisely, Hoffman's doesn't actually develop a notion of sin. That remains to be the task of Climacus and Anti-Climacus. What Hoffman's seems to have accomplished is a study of sinful consciousness. Hoffman's holds the view that anxiety itself is the muted or disguised expression of the spirit. And similar to other existential moods, anxiety is an accumulation of the spirit, an accumulation of concentration aimed at expressing the spirit, at giving it form and awareness. But it's a failed one. It's basically about this attempt at self-expression which goes awry, which goes astray. Similarly, in a particularly unusual passage, Judge Willem inquires about depression, Tungsin. And he says, what then is it? Well, it is hysteria of the spirit. There comes a moment in a person's life when immediacy is rhyme, so to speak. I don't know, maybe this is a type, is it rhyme or ripe? And when the spirit requires a higher form, when it wants to hold of itself as spirit. As immediate spirit, a person is bound up with all the earthly life, and now spirit wants to gather itself out of this dispersion, so to speak, and to transfigure, forklare, itself in itself. The personality wants to become conscious in its eternal validity, end quote. So that's the idea I'm working with, that anxiety is a very similar kind of process in which there's this drive to self-expression which becomes repressed and muted, which becomes disguised as a different enterprise, as a different goal in life and such. Judge Willem continues, then the spirit masses within him, within Emperor Nero, like a dark cloud. Its wrath broods over his soul, and it becomes an anxiety that does not cease even in the moment of enjoyment. So the mood, as it were, continues in its second life as this kind of ever-threatening background of the ordinary life. Now, I will rephrase the whole argument in much fewer words. What Hoffman's attempts is a phenomenology of spirit. It is a study of the forms in which the spirit appears, manifests itself. In order to assess such claim, I propose now, with our principal question about the upbuilding and educational aspect of the concept of anxiety in mind, to discuss the source itself, Hegel's Phänomenologie des Geistes. Yeah, I'm sorry about this. We'll have a bit of Hegel again. So Hegel's Phänomenologie is and that's where it makes sense, I think, and I hope that I made this clear. Because in Hegel, the phenomenology is a science of appearance, shine. It is a science dedicated to the study of how knowledge, or Wissen, appears, and how awareness appears. Again, Wissen. Hegel is playing on this dual meaning of the word Wissen, that it can be both consciousness and knowledge. So in the phenomenology, it is about the appearance of knowledge and awareness, which I hope you see is very similar to my claim about the concept of anxiety. In the course of the phenomenology, we follow the dialectical development of natural consciousness. The point of phenomenology is then to demonstrate the essential and necessary steps, and necessary maybe in a little different, let's leave that, let's leave necessity out of this. Steps undertaken by consciousness on its path to knowledge. Hegel construes an ideal history of such development of consciousness, or, which is the same, of knowledge. Even though this is an ideal history, it is a history embedded in the actual history of humanity, in the achievements of the Greeks, in the experience of Christianity, in the failed and renewed ethos of the Enlightenment. It is a history of the spirit, a history in which the spirit, or rational or intelligent intersubjectivity. It is a history of spirit giving itself form, understanding itself, learning of itself. Shortly, in Hegel's own words, the series of configurations, or Gestaltungen, which consciousness goes through along this road is, in reality, the detailed history of the education of consciousness itself to the standpoint of science. So for Hegel, the phenomenology of spirit is nothing more than a description of the education of the spirit going through its standpoints until it reaches awareness and knowledge of itself. Now, Hegel's word for education, Bildung, gets often translated as formative education. Bildung ought to be understood as the building up of a personality or of a culture or of the spirit. Yet, heavens forbid we understand education as edification, as upbuilding. I quote Hegel, "Philosophy must beware of the wish to be edifying, for such ideal entities and purposes of this kind are empty, ineffectual words which lift up the heart but leave reason unsatisfied, which edify but raise no edifice." Hegel is beautiful, isn't he? So for Hegel, edification isn't the same as education in this sense. Education is the building up, where edifying is nothing more than just lifting the spirit in almost psychological way. A formative education presupposes incompletion. It is a process of perfection or constitution. In this sense, the natural consciousness becomes educated formatively. It becomes instructed and fundamentally transformed by the instruction. This is Hegel's notion of experience. He says, the science of this pathway is the science of the experience which consciousness goes through. So again, that's what he does. He comments on this pathway of the experience made by consciousness. Experience in this sense is far from theoretical insight, far from a simple represented object or something like that. Experience is the process of the realization of the notion in Hegel's philosophy. So natural consciousness, intelligent life, which is the subject of this realization, that which realizes things, necessarily starts at a lower and mistaken standpoint. In order to realize the notion in its truth, the individual natural consciousness must lose its own truth on the way. It must start at one standpoint and then lose the standpoint in order to get the good standpoint. So in Hegel, and this is really something quite striking, the same pathway, the same education is also the pathway of doubt, or more precisely, the way of despair. So the individual consciousness despairs on this way because it's being basically bereft of the earlier standpoints. It's being made to lose what it believed to be true. Natural consciousness, which becomes educated, despairs and doubts. It becomes, in the course of this formative education, split in two. It becomes split between conflicting demands, ideas, notions, desires, and so on. The internally torn consciousness is the product of the first 4 chapters of the Phenomenology, and by the end of chapter 4, it acquires the title of the unhappy consciousness. The unhappy consciousness is the product of this education, but not of education in the sense of school education, but rather in the sense of the experience of loss, defeat, negativity, in the sense that work forms and shapes or formatively educates the individual. Hegel's phenomenology, understood as such education, can then be, and I quote Hegel, be regarded as the path of the natural consciousness which presses forward to true knowledge, or as the way of the soul which journeys through the series of its own configurations as though they were the stations appointed for it by its own nature, so that it may purify itself for the life of the spirit and achieve finally, through a complete experience of itself, the awareness of what it really is in itself. Natural consciousness, or as the plot thickens, the unhappy consciousness, seems to be an abstraction, a sort of idealized subject of history. In principle, this is true. But Hegel's agenda is not that of writing a history. Hegel's phenomenology constitutes and provides foundation of his science by wriggling truth out of its earlier manifestations, by writing a book which provides awareness of such knowledge. This is a almost Kierkegaardian interpretation that us reading the book, we are the ones educated. Now, so we, the readers, usually adopt different standpoints and have inadequate notions. It is us who need to be educated, instructed, transformed. So Hegel, one more time, says, the task of leading the individual from his uneducated standpoint to knowledge had to be seen in its universal sense, just as it was the universal individual, self-conscious spirit, whose formative education had to be studied. So, we are to be educated very much like the natural consciousness. Consciousness in the vast space of world history needed education. The development of the individual mirrors the development of the species, of the art, of the Gattung. So to quote Hegel one last time, the single individual must also pass through the formative stages of the universal spirit, so far as their content is concerned, but as shapes which spirit has already left behind, as stages on a way that has been made level with toil. So the connection, I hope, between Hoffman and Hegel, between the phenomenology of spirit and the concept of anxiety, should be more apparent by now. The ontogenetic development follows in the footsteps of the phylogenetic history. We, the later individuals, are like Adam. We are supposed to be like him. And our personal history repeats the fundamental stages of mankind. We must individually pass through the formative stages required of man. There are crucial differences between the two, obviously, such as that, most importantly, Hegel's goal is to proceed from difference to identity, so to speak. So in other words, the unhappy consciousness becomes eventually whole in the notions of conscience, whereas Kierkegaard insists on the opposite direction of development. The direction leads from identity to difference, and the education in principle consists of uncovering more and more profoundly the fundamental contradictoriness of existence. Now let me get back to the opening quote. Anxiety is freedom's possibility, and only such anxiety is through faith absolutely educative, because it consumes all finite ends and discovers all their deceptiveness. Well, in the concept of anxiety, education of possibility seems, at least from the standpoint, to me, almost as this education which, in the sense of going backwards from the culture, from basically this understanding of what we achieved, from the understanding of civilization, and going backwards in this, and Geo uses this metaphor a few times, going backwards in the sense of disenchanting spells of finite securities, basically waking up from the dream of security. So education as original experience is not, as in Hegel, the movement forward in which we acquire better understanding of ourselves in this sense, but it is a better understanding of ourselves in the sense of losing the education that we previously, or losing the culture that we previously acquired. Whoever is educated by anxiety, says Hoffman, is educated by possibility, and only he who is educated by possibility is educated according to his infinitude. Therefore, possibility is the weightiest of all categories. Let me make this point even clearer. Being educated by possibility introduces the absolute demand. It introduces the absolute respect and earnestness. It basically qualifies existence. Without such education, existence fails to understand the dubious value of finitude. In finitude, or in the mundane, in temporality, one believes to find possibility, but what possibility is it? What is possible in the world? The worldly possibilities provide only conditional and limited agency. It's the possibility of, well, being a gardener or being a cook on a ship and such. My agency in this sense, from Kierkegaard's point of view, is basically non-essential. It is not the existential agency that I'm looking for. Exactly compared to the finitude of the world, accentuated and contrasted by it, there manifests itself possibility as such. The fundamental possibility of being able, that's the product of anxiety. Being able to do what? Well, to do what matters. I'm using these vague formulations to steer away from the strictly religious phrasing of the possibility as the possibility of eternal blessedness. But being educated by possibility does involve a radical turn away from the possibilities of the world, a movement of transcendence, reaching beyond the temporally possible. So, this kind of education, and I'm running out of time, I guess. This kind of education happens in anxiety or through anxiety, by the means of anxiety. Heidegger will understand anxiety precisely as such suspension of the world in total, as a suspension of mundane meaning as such. In Kierkegaard, the education of anxiety makes a similar suspension, but also posits the absolute demand of the other or capitalized possibility. In anxiety, one experiences the actuality of freedom in the form of the possibility of being able. Now, this is another way of saying what we heard yesterday, even in Danish, which I will not try to do, that anxiety is the actuality of freedom as a possibility for possibility. So, if I were to say differently, it basically says, it might be the case that I really could. Maybe it is the case that I could. Maybe I could. Anxiety is the actuality of a possibility for a possibility in this sense. It is the actualized relation to one's fundamental possibility of agency. So this freedom is not the bravado of we can do it or I can do it. No, it is the consuming uncertainty of possibly being able. But what makes this anxiety of freedom consuming is this absolute certainty of the demand placed on me, of the demand of embracing this freedom of trying, which I have to do. So the backward movement of anxiety or education is a deconstruction of mundane securities. Hoffman says, so when the individual through anxiety is educated unto faith, anxiety will eradicate precisely what it brings forth itself. And what did it bring forth? Well, those forms that I discussed earlier, the form of, let's say, fate or guilt, the earlier standpoints. So anxiety is supposed to basically eradicate the earlier securities, the earlier standpoints. One has to give up on worldly hope or possibility in order to have possibility. In The Sickness Unto Death, Anticlimacus associates the deficit of possibility with trivial existence of the bourgeois. But spoken from the perspective of the world, such existence has all the possibilities. It can become successful in the world. It just misses the capitalized possibility, which transcends the worldly ends. Okay, now I think that in 2 minutes I will unfortunately not be able to talk about the difference between the upbuilding and the edifying in the concept of anxiety. So I will just make one last point, and that's that. So is the concept of anxiety an upbuilding work, and in what sense? No, it isn't. It isn't basically because it doesn't have the quality of the edifying that. It is not. It is more a propedeutic rather than the edifying. It is when edifying. It needs to be differentiated from deliberation, because as Kierkegaard says, a deliberation does not presuppose conceptual definitions as given and understood. Therefore, it must not so much touch, relieve, and convince as a. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to make it fast. Relieve and convince as awaken and prod people and sharpen their thinking. The moment of deliberation is thus prior to action. And therefore, what matters is to set all the elements properly into motion. The deliberation must be a gadfly. Its tone is thus quite different from that of an edifying discourse, which reposes in a mood, while the deliberation must have a mood that is, in the good sense, impatient, fiery. Deliberation is something that Kierkegaard associates with exactly this kind of treatise, that is the concept of anxiety, which explains things. But an upbuilding discourse or builds up on these deliberations is later, and its goal is different. So okay, I will end here. I'm out of time. Right. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll introduce our next panel of Judith and Eleanor.
Hello everyone, I'm Giuditta Corbella and I come from Milan, from the Catholic University of Milan. Today I'm going to speak about the relationship between Kierkegaard and Martin Heidegger. As you all know, there has been a running debate for more than 70 years regarding the influence of Kierkegaard on Heidegger. It is timely, therefore, that Friedrich Wilhelm von Ehrmann published a work of Heidegger in December 2018, so last year, which represents a turning point in this long-lasting struggle. Heidegger's own annotations elaborate on his relationship with Kierkegaard, deepening what he expressed in 1923 when he said that Kierkegaard gave impulses to his philosophy. This book, volume 82 of the complete works of Martin Heidegger, Gesamtausgabe, contains a series of annotations that Heidegger wrote during the 1930s. It is entitled Zu eigenen Veröffentlichungen, about my own publications, as it merges different manuscripts in which Heidegger comments, modifies, and criticizes his own books. From now on, I will talk about this book with just the title Annotations or Anmerkungen. More than half of it focuses on Sein und Zeit, and in these pages Heidegger confronts not just his own text, but also the main criticisms expressed by other philosophers during the 1920s and the 1930s. In the paper, through analyzing these annotations, my aim is to support two main theses. First of all, Heidegger was influenced by Kierkegaard, and the main influence, as noted both by Heidegger and the critics, concerns the notions of existence and possibility. Hence, it is related to the modal incompleteness of human being. Secondly, Heidegger relates the religious nature of Kierkegaard's message to the problem of the Christian existential. Postulating that Kierkegaard's philosophy starts from a Christian point of view about existence, in Introduction to Metaphysics, Heidegger accuses the Christian existential of having a specific problem, that is, the tendency to dogmatism. My paper is divided in three more or less small parts: evidence of the Kierkegaardian influence in the works of Heidegger, directly dealing with the annotations to being and time, which provide new evidence of the Kierkegaardian influence, and a closer explanation of the main problem that Heidegger has when he deals with Kierkegaard. Let us now briefly consider the status questionis. Generally speaking, it can be said that over the last decades, critics shifted from an existentialist to an ontological interpretation of Heidegger. The former focuses on Heidegger's description of Dasein contained in Sein und Zeit, while the latter concentrates on the relationship between being and beings, and sometimes reduces the Dasein analytic to a form of correlativistic theory of meaning. That Heidegger was invited to the Paris Conference on Kierkegaard Vivant in 1964 offers a significant clue to the popularity of the existentialist interpretation. Anyway, after the publication of other writings by Heidegger, it was clear to critics that he had to be interpreted as a pure ontologist, as he would say. Consequently, the critics started a process of minimization of every existentialist mons present in being and time. This process of minimization implied also the elimination of every evidence of a Kierkegaard-Heidegger discipleship. The main problem of this controversy is that the assonances between Heidegger and Kierkegaard, as you all know, are too pronounced to be ignored, while at the same time, Heidegger's prohibitions are too firm to be violated. Nevertheless, several attempts have been made to demonstrate Kierkegaard's influence, though no clear statement of discipleship has been found. Heidegger confounds the critics, trying to avoid any existentialist interpretation of his philosophy, even of the existential analytic drawn in being and time. We can say that the general contemporary consensus is that, at least formally, Heidegger's problem is being. Therefore, being and time is a phenomenology of being that starts with a phenomenology of human being as an eminent one. However, the question of Heidegger's discipleship with Kierkegaard has yet to be explained. After many pages of being and time, only 3 footnotes refer to Kierkegaard, and in them, Heidegger always expresses the same judgment. In one of them, he says, Kierkegaard explicitly thought through the problem of existence as existential in a penetrating way, but the existential problematic is foreign to him, end quote. The dyad existential contains 2 main concepts of being and time. The first adjective, existential, isolates what belongs to the singular existence that is understood in its concrete immediacy. Consequently, it is opposed to the second adjective, existential, which refers to the elements that characterize the existence in its own being. Kierkegaard thinks existentially. This means that he doesn't have a purely ontological point of view about existence, but a concrete and prejudicial one. In one of his lectures on Nietzsche, Heidegger deepens this judgment when he levels a heavier accusation at Kierkegaard, who, quote, is not a thinker but a religious writer. However, Heidegger alternates his criticisms with some appreciation of Kierkegaard. His 1921 course, Phenomenological Interpretations of Aristotle, begins with a Kierkegaardian motto. What is more, many of his letters to Jaspers testify to a constant and systematic engagement with Kierkegaard's philosophy. Moreover, in the wonderful preface to the 1923 course, Ontology Hermeneutic of Facticity, he says, companions in my searching were the young Luther and the paragon Aristotle, whom Luther hated. Impulses were given by Kierkegaard, and Husserl opened my eyes. So, because of his extraordinary spiritual and religious acumen, Kierkegaard ranks among the list of the masters, since he contributes significantly to the analytic of Dasein. Though Heidegger credited Kierkegaard for penetrating the human soul and existence, nevertheless, this massive existential database needed to be substantially modified. Hence, Heidegger intended to collect Kierkegaard's results, rethinking them in the light of the Seinsfrage. Now we move on to consider Heidegger's Anmerkungen zu Sein und Zeit, where he, generally speaking, he exhibits a tired tone. He is actually fed up with critics who are obsessed with the problem of defining and locating him inside the history of philosophy. He refuses any binding dependence and any absolute discipleship, and this particularly relates to Kierkegaard. In one of the annotations, he parrots the critics and says, Kierkegaard wrote a book, The Concept of Anxiety. In Heidegger, we find the anxiety. Furthermore, Heidegger refers specifically to Kierkegaard and uses also, as a matter of fact, the concept of existence, existential, existential. Hence, the philosophy of Heidegger is Kierkegaardian, end quote. Heidegger's attitude towards Kierkegaard represents an interesting case of intellectual discipleship. As a matter of fact, Heidegger uses Kierkegaard's notion of existence to fight anything like ontology of man, and his notion of repetition to avoid any kind of idealistic dialectic. Nevertheless, he refuses to be equated to Kierkegaard, who thinks existentially and cannot be considered either a master or a philosopher. The accusation of thinking existentially is connected to the notion of existence, which is analyzed in one of the manuscripts of the Anmerkungen. Thus, the beginning of the manuscript represents, in my opinion, a turning point in the Heidegger-Kierkegaard debate, primarily because Heidegger makes here two major admissions. He writes, "But it cannot be due to an accident or just the lack of ability of the contemporaries that this attempt, contained in Being and Time, has been evaluated as philosophy of existence." End quote. And then he goes on emphatically and he writes, "The connection with Kierkegaard, so between me, Heidegger, and Kierkegaard is clear. Every reader and person who is familiar with Kierkegaard sees the constant and general dependence of the treatise Being and Time from this thinker." So the key concept is the notion of existence, which is both the core of the dialogue and the center of the conflict. Heidegger, in this manuscript, acknowledges that he derived his concept of existence from Kierkegaard, precisely because the Danish use this word only for men. For the first time, he says, Kierkegaard achieved this restriction of the metaphysical concept of existence to man, clearly looking at the metaphysics of Schelling. End quote. In this sense, Schelling's conception occupies a halfway position between the medieval, for Heidegger, in Heidegger's opinion, between the medieval scholastic one, which understands existence as a simple being there of an object, and the Kierkegaardian innovation, which sees existence as a human mode of being. Like the Schellingian concept, Heidegger also accepts the Leibnizian characterization of beings as compatible to his own conception of existence. The Leibnizian vis activa is the impulse to overcome itself in order to realize its own potentialities. Thus, in Heidegger's opinion, the Leibniz, Schelling, Kierkegaard, Heidegger philosophical quartet shares the same concept of existing being as a being provided with potentialities that constitute it as dynamic. The significant contribution of Kierkegaard was the restriction of these features to just one being, the human being. And Heidegger is explicitly in debt and grateful to Kierkegaard for this attribution of existence to man. Now we need to go just a little bit deeper into Heidegger's conception of existence as the mode of being of Dasein. In Being and Time, he says, "The characteristics to be found in this being, this Dasein, are thus not objectively present attributes of an objectively present being, but rather possible ways for it to be, and only this." End quote. The Dasein has no rigid essence that precedes its own existence, but rather its existence as priority over the essence, is the place where the essence is progressively shaped and built. In paragraph 31 of Being and Time, Heidegger clarifies his notion of existence as being possible as the foremost ontological character of Dasein. The being possible, he writes, which Dasein always is existentially, is also distinguished from empty logical possibility. As a modal category, possibility means what is not yet real and not always necessary. It is less than reality and necessity. In contrast, possibility as in existential is the most primordial and the ultimate positive ontological determination of Dasein. End quote. In his Naturbericht, Heidegger develops his notion of existential possibility in connection with ancient philosophy and praises Aristotle for having interpreted the being in its movedness. Thanks to Aristotle, against the Eleatic megaric actualism, it is possible to justify the becoming as the passage from potency to act. Moreover, Aristotle noted that it is necessary to have access to the phenomenon of potency as such in order to introduce it as separated from the act. Thus, Aristotle demonstrated the phenomenological discoverability of the possible, which is not something less than the actual, but has its own consistency. The possible can be accessed as such, and it has, as Heidegger says, its own silent force. As witnessed in the manuscript about existence, Heidegger not only develops his thought in the dialogue with Aristotle, but also with Tommaso, Suarez, Leibniz, and Kierkegaard. By asserting that Dasein is its possibility, he uses the term possibility not as a synonym of non-contradictory, but rather with the meaning of active potentiality, as the capacity to perform some action. The late scholastic names this concept potentia activa and separates it from the pure possibilitas. Then Heidegger revises the scholastic concept of potentia activa with reference to Leibniz. In the Leibnizian vis activa, he finds the idea of a living being that is its own potentia, and that is not something to which the potency was added afterwards. As mentioned earlier, this concept of existence that Heidegger finds also in Schelling's conception to man is what fascinates him also in Kierkegaard, together with the restriction to man. Quote, though one sees also the differences between Kierkegaard and being and time. This is one of the Anmerkungen. A difference is extremely perceivable. The Christian is left out from being and time. Kierkegaard's Christian existential philosophy is just used for an atheist philosophy. End quote. Here, the accusation of existential thinking obtains a specific definition. Heidegger writes, by existential concept of existence in Kierkegaard and Jaspers, I mean the being itself of man, inasmuch as he is interested in himself as this being, from a moral, practical point of view. By existential concept of existence, I mean the being itself of man, inasmuch as he is related in his own essence to the being of the totality of beings, and, in general, he gains his own essence from this ecstatic relationship to being. End quote. In Heidegger's view, and this is really important in my opinion, Christianity is at the same time the cause of the development of the notion of existence and the motive of the crime. He says actually that this restriction, so the Kierkegaardian restriction of existence to man, arises out of the Christian original interest in the reality of human persons, end quote. Finally, having discussed the notion of existence, the paper addresses the problem of existential thinking. We can analyze this through another manuscript, wherein Heidegger deals with the intellectual crisis he finds himself in during the 1930s. He asserts that nowadays the meaning of being has been forgotten, but at the same time he sees this forgetfulness as an extremely peculiar revelation of being itself. Given these circumstances, his problem is to decide how to elaborate this forgetfulness as a peculiar way of revelation. How can one save oneself from forgetting the same forgetfulness of being? And how can one, in response, get possession of it? While wrestling with this philosophical impasse, Heidegger goes back to Kierkegaard and to his concept of repetition in order to find therein a solution to the problem that affects him. The peculiar style of these annotations contained in the repetition manuscript makes them hard to read, but at the same time, it reveals the deep estimation that Heidegger held for Kierkegaard. Heidegger's intuition leads him to solve his theoretical problem by using the Kierkegaardian concept of repetition as individualization of the universal in the concrete life of the individual. The repetition is not there, he writes, as something ready to use that meets us ontically. The repetition is just in the way in which Kierkegaard understands it, as the fulfillment of the actual realization of the idea in the individual, end quote. The quotation presents repetition as a double mechanism. A universal realizes itself in the single individual, and this one fulfills this realization by assuming it. In this sense, Heidegger recalls Kierkegaard's reform of the dialectic, in which the singular doesn't become a moment of the universal, but is maintained in its irreducibility. The exception, however, writes Kierkegaard, thinks the universal with intense passion. Thus, the notion of repetition works for Heidegger as a solution to the becoming problematic. At the beginning of the repetition, Kierkegaard presents a series of metaphors to explain the difference that occurs between hope, recollection, and repetition. Heidegger examines the third one and writes a very concise note. Quote, that life is a repetition. Hope, beckoning fruit that does not satisfy. Recollection, petty travel money that does not satisfy. Repetition, the daily bread that satisfies with blessing. And then, at the end of the note, he concludes and writes, being satisfied, ? Considering also other Heideggerian texts, following the last repetition of being satisfied with a question mark can actually be read to mean that, even if Heidegger's will to embrace the forgetfulness of being partially coincides, in his opinion, with Kierkegaard's attempt to repeat the universal, nevertheless, Heidegger cannot accept any satisfying food, if this implies the extinction of the question that characterizes not only philosophy but Dasein in general. Consequently, the question mark coincides as a criticism of Kierkegaard, whose philosophy is, quote, traditional and empty of questions, at the service of theology and metaphysics, even emptier of questions. If we elaborate the Heideggerian relationship between theology, Christian faith, and philosophy, we must present two fundamental proofs. The first one is the 1922 autobiographical note where Heidegger writes that an authentic scientific inquiry, free from every occult tie, is not possible if one remains faithful to the point of view of faith. The second one is the concise statement according to which the majority of people that, with his own means, can find the truth, doesn't want to find it, and rather prefers to nail it on the cross. End quote. This statement briefly expresses what Heidegger writes in Introduction to Metaphysics, when he says, one who holds on to such faith, the Christian faith, as a basis, can perhaps emulate and participate in the asking of our question in a certain way, but he cannot authentically question without giving himself up as a believer. He can act only as if. End quote. We now begin to hear the accusation of being dogmatic. This obtains in Heidegger a specific theoretical justification, since his philosophy is, as Claudia Serban says, a phenomenology of question, in which the question has a primacy over the answer, just like the possible has a primacy over the actual. Therefore, the traditional struggle between faith and reason does not consist in a divergence of opinions, but rather in the fact that faith prevents man from the more natural and essential act of reason, that is, the act of questioning. As Niebuhr said, nothing is so incredible as an answer to an unasked question. Well, Heidegger sees every word of the Bible as dogma, and this latter as a pre-given and ready-to-use answer to unasked questions, and what is more, as an answer that prevents man from questioning. The critique of the Christian existential continues in Heidegger's numerous annotations regarding the problem of eternity. Two of them are specifically directed against Kierkegaard. The first occurs in the repetition manuscript and reads, repetition and iteration, repetition and application, repetition and eternity. bracket, this is the real repetition, end quote. The last piece of the puzzle is an annotation from another manuscript that says, to stay in the nothingness, namely in the closestness to being, not like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche who run away in the eternity, end quote. So the perfect form of repetition has something to do with eternity, but unfortunately Heidegger cannot accept eternity, and nor can he accept final satisfaction, since they both represent the annihilation of the potency-act dynamic. Indeed, man has possibility and is free to choose one of them only inasmuch as he is finite. In several texts, Heidegger postulates the connection between possibility and finitude, which coincides with the critique against omnipotence and eternity. The one who can do anything, argues Heidegger, can do nothing, since potency means finitude. One who is eternal, he insists, can do nothing, since temporality works as a principium individuationis of the situation and hence is the genetic locus of potentialities. The attempts to put potency in an eternal being or to transform man into an eternal being betray the nature of Dasein. That is why in 1931 Heidegger writes, "Where there is force and power, there is finitude. Hence, God is not powerful, and omnipotence, considered properly, is a concept which dissolves into thin air." So, there is an ontological influence of Kierkegaard, both through the notion of existence and of repetition. However, every ontological concept is embodied by an existential thought, and according to Heidegger, Kierkegaard's is unacceptable. What is surprising is that an ontic existential ideal was always considered by Heidegger as a necessary condition of any ontological reflection. And in Being and Time he wrote, "But does not a definite ontic interpretation of authentic existence, a factical ideal of Dasein, underlie our ontological interpretation of Dasein? Indeed, this fact must not be denied and must be understood in its positive necessity." End quote. Furthermore, Heidegger has no problem extrapolating philosophical concepts from their original ontic context. Why, therefore, is Kierkegaard so problematic? And the last annotation I would like to read, Heidegger writes, "Kierkegaard questions existentially. Existence is the subjectivity, and surely the Christian one. Question: are we Christian? Let us believe. Christian relationship with God / being relationship, Christ and the truth." Heidegger ponders here the possibility of using Kierkegaard's concept. In doing so, he confronts the center of the problem, namely the possibility of equating God and being. Is the relationship between God and the Kierkegaardian individual comparable to the relationship between the Heideggerian Dasein and its own being? Moreover, is it possible to use the discovered features of the Creator without assuming the existence of the Creator? The analysis of the Anmerkungen provides a reasonable amount of evidence of an ontological Kierkegaardian influence on Heidegger. Ontological because the notion of existence is used by Heidegger as the mode of being of Dasein. Though Heidegger sees in Kierkegaard's factical ideal a problem for his own philosophy, nevertheless he tries to elaborate the concepts as much as he can in order to extrapolate them from their original ontic context. Therefore, reading the annotations, one can observe the progressive shaping of an authority. The outcome of this complex and problematic process is, according to the well-chosen expression of Vincent McCarthy, an influence hidden and in full view. Heidegger's crime of misstating and hiding this influence was known, but the motive was still unknown, you could say. In conclusion, despite their chaotic style, the Anmerkungen describe an indirect master-disciple relationship in which both of them are pushed to the limit, wherein lies the decision for or against the most radical philosophical questions. For Heidegger, unfortunately, the decision for God implies the decision against philosophy. The theoretical struggle described in the annotations is, therefore, documentary proof of the pouring Kierkegaardian confession that Heidegger makes to Jaspers in 1935, when he speaks about the two thorns in the flesh, the confrontation with the fate of the tradition and the failure of the rectorate, that already contain enough of what must actually be overcome. Thank you very much.
I'm Eleanor Helms from California Polytechnic, which is unsurprisingly in California. So my title today is Kierkegaard's Metaphysics, a Defense of Abstract Possibilities, and I hope that you don't like it. I'm disagreeing with a lot of you. So Martin Heidegger opens an introduction to metaphysics with the timeless question, inherited from the Greeks: why are there beings instead of nothing? Kierkegaard approaches this question, as does Heidegger later, by considering not only what is, so what exists in actuality, but also the possibilities that surround existence. Understanding beings requires illuminating what is not there or present, as Heidegger will later put it, and in fact could never become present. That is, in the language of phenomenology, what is intrinsically empty, what is not in addition to what is. When a human being is in question, these empty possibilities are often merely mental and conceptual. In addition to concrete activities like building a birdhouse, we live lives rich in abstractions. We see an animal and identify it as an instance of a kind. We seek abstract goods like justice and politeness. We engage in dialectic. Rather than Kierkegaard's writing motivating us to do more, feel more, or commit more decisively, terms associated with popular existentialism, I think what we mainly find in Kierkegaard is a treasure trove of conceptual distinctions that enable us to notice more, recognize more, and question more, all of which belong squarely within traditional philosophy. Good philosophy, of course, can and should lead to doing, feeling, and committing in new and better ways. With the help of Kierkegaard's concepts, we can treat people as syntheses of the temporal and eternal, as well as distinguish between preferential love and neighbor love, even when these would result in the same concrete actions. Yet some contemporary Kierkegaard commentators interpret Kierkegaard's exhortations toward existence as a turn toward concreteness and away from abstraction, without noticing that this interpretation reduces Kierkegaard's richly varied modalities of existence to just one, empirical actuality. This type of view is fashionable in recent continental philosophy, including Levinas's fascination with the concrete other, Merleau-Ponty's rejection of a worldless self. So it's not surprising that critiquing abstract third-personal reflection has become an accepted part of Kierkegaard's studies as well, guaranteeing his philosophical distinctness from his influential predecessors, Kant and Hegel. Yet while Kierkegaard's work, of course, includes parables, metaphors, and other poetic language, yes, I have read Kierkegaard, it also hones our abilities to conceptualize and abstract. While not ends in themselves, through Kierkegaard's abstractions, we gain a metaphysical view of the self that Kierkegaard believes has practical value. This should not surprise us greatly as philosophers. Plato thought training to recognize the forms would help us live better. Kierkegaard, I suggest, offers something similar: training in abstraction with existential value. So today, I will clarify the metaphysical view of the self that I think Kierkegaard is putting forward, focusing on sickness unto death. I'll distinguish my view from that of Patrick Stokes, whose account contains some of the components of the abstract minimal self I'll present here. He nevertheless continues to emphasize the concrete, first-personal, and experienceable, or what he calls phenomenal, components of the self, in explicit opposition to its formal and abstract elements. Like Stokes, I think the metaphysical problem of identity is central to Kierkegaard's work as a whole, but not just the problem of personal identity, I find, But the broader question, taking us all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, though I will not follow there today, of what makes any object the same over time, capable of undergoing change. And like the Greeks, Kierkegaard trains us to look beyond appearances. Two presentations may look quite different, even contradictory, and yet be appearances of the same object. In Kierkegaard's studies, we usually describe such contradictions as resolved by a decision, or a strong passion, or an attitude such as humility that lets the contradiction live. But holding together different appearances as belonging to the same object in a non-stipulative, non-fideistic way requires conceptual abilities as well, including the basic philosophical insight that a thing is not its appearances. That is, we never have the thing in itself, which serves as a rational ground for our openness to its appearing differently, even in contradictory ways. Such conceptual distinctions are fundamental for Kierkegaard, I argue, and ought not to be downplayed in favor of standard proposals urging the importance of decision, passion, action, or even first-personal experience. So, in notes about the preface to The Sickness Unto Death, Anticlimacus writes, "To the closing passage, but that the form is what it is, I have thought of adding, apart from the fact that it is rooted in my being who I am. But this would be going too far in transforming a fictitious character into actuality. A fictitious character has no other possibility than the one he is. He cannot declare that he also could speak in another way and yet be the same. He has no identity that encompasses many possibilities." So one thing to notice about this passage, which is again a comment Kierkegaard makes later on the preface to Sickness Unto Death, is that the actual individual is not defined as the one who in fact acts, but the one who, perhaps paradoxically, has many possibilities. The fictitious character, by contrast, has no enduring identity underlying different actualizations. So the actualization is not what distinguishes them, it's their possibilities. This description cuts against a prima facie tendency to associate fiction with possibility and actuality with commitment and finitude. Here, the fictional character lacks possibility and is merely concrete. That is, a single concretion. The question of whether a being or what kinds of beings can undergo change or have different appearances while remaining themselves is, of course, the classic question of a field philosophers call metaphysics. Yet, as I have suggested, it is commonly thought to be a virtue of Kierkegaard's philosophy that he shifts attention away from metaphysical analyses toward concrete actuality. There is a tendency to treat abstract categories like possibility in Kierkegaard as referring to concrete possibilities, actualizable by a particular person in a specific situation, and real enough to exert what Daniel Dahlstrom calls an unrelenting pull. I propose instead that the kind of lived experience toward which Kierkegaard urges us requires a philosophically rich life of the mind. To be good readers of Kierkegaard, we need to be prepared to do some good metaphysics. The question of Kierkegaard's relation to metaphysics is particularly relevant for Sickness Unto Death, since this is one of a handful of texts in which Kierkegaard, through Anticlimacus, is likely to be treated as offering a phenomenology, in this case, of despair. And I think we do find a phenomenology in Sickness Unto Death, but one which progresses logically and dialectically, rather than merely descriptively or first-personally. Now, first-personal description is the defining feature of phenomenology only in the popular, non-Hegelian, non-Husserlian sense, along the lines of Nagel's What It Is Like to Be a Bat. An interpretation critiqued by Husserlians, such as John Drummond, Dan Zahavi. Instead, I think the kind of phenomenology Kierkegaard offers, including in Sickness Unto Death, is very like what we find in Kant and Hegel, and later on Husserl. And I think we would do well to go ahead and call it metaphysical, in the sense that Kant also is. The different uses of phenomenological create confusion, including for Kierkegaard studies. Dahlstrom, for example, proposes a purportedly phenomenological reading, but concludes that sickness unto death presents different despairs, in the plural, despairs, through which a person progresses concretely. He insists that Kierkegaard's distinctions are not theoretical, but relate to, quote, living and practicing either one of two forms of despair, fatalism or autonomy, end quote. Dahlstrom's interpretation fits well with other scholarly readings, where the forms of despair are not formal, as we would find in Husserl, but real temporal states in which a person might live, say, for 2 years before transitioning to another for, say, 7 months. In continental philosophy, we call this hypostasization, treating a formal, transcendental moment as concrete, an object of possible experience. Anticlimacus is clear that the forms of despair do not exist independently. If they did, there would be nothing to prevent them from being described independently. Instead, he writes, no form of despair can be defined directly, that is, undialectically, but only by reflecting upon its opposite. Much as Kant proposes solving such problems by recognizing that apparent things, like space and time, are merely formal, I'm suggesting that Kierkegaard's famous stages, as well as the variations of despair and sickness unto death, are likewise merely formal. That is, they are idealized abstractions from lived experience, not directly lived temporal or developmental stages. And it's interesting that in Jakob's talk on Hegel, he called it an ideal history, but Hegel actually thinks these are lived, right, that these happened. So we can fill these idealizations out fictionally if we choose, and at times Kierkegaard chooses to, as with the characters in Either Or, with what he calls a rhetorical presentation. But we're missing the point of that rhetoric if we look around the world for aesthetes, ethicists, or humorists. The distinction between ideal possibilities and concrete actualities may be Kierkegaard's main difference from Hegel, but in a different sense than is usually thought. So while Hegel thinks that history progresses concretely through a dialectic of developmental stages, Kierkegaard does not presume these stages have actually occurred or are occurring now, and so there's similarly no guarantee of forward movement in the temporal future. Kierkegaard questions the concrete instantiation of dialectical stages, but not dialectic itself, which he relies on in various works, very obviously in Concept of Anxiety, and Sickness Unto Death, which consists of layered variations that progress logically and teleologically toward an essential core that is not directly presentable, very much like Hegel. But unlike Hegel, who readily transfers these logical distinctions to historical existence, Kierkegaard argues for a sharp distinction. Just because something is conceptually distinguishable does not mean it ever can be, has been, or will be realized in concrete, empirical existence. So Kierkegaard is not less abstract than Hegel, but more. In Sickness Unto Death, dialectical distinctions serve to clarify freedom and despair as concepts. Dialectic allows Anticlimacus to present apparently contradictory conclusions as both true, such as that despair is a problem for freedom, but also the cure. Anticlimacus, I suggest, is not here asking us to humbly accept ambiguity or engage more actively in something. Instead, he claims a healthy person is somehow able to resolve the contradiction, which he contrasts with the rheumatic, who is at the mercy of the elements. Anticlimacus accuses the drafts from which the rheumatic suffers as being undialectical, which is an odd critique of elements. He writes, a draft is a contradiction, for a draft is disparately or undialectically cold and warm. But a good, healthy body resolves this contradiction and does not notice the draft. Physical health, I take it, is a metaphor for conceptual health. for what an individual's mind is capable of when it's robust with metaphysical distinctions, and does not look at contradictory properties and conclude they must belong to separately existing things, to one of which she must now commit. Instead, in encountering tensions and paradoxes, a healthy mind looks for ways differences might be synthesized as non-independent elements of a single complex whole. But we miss the unifying role of Kierkegaard's stages if we treat them as standalone states, something an individual can be for a short period of time before changing into another. We need instead to look past or through these different appearances as readers for an underlying essential core. As abstracted aspects rather than concrete objects, the forms of despair in Sickness Unto Death highlight different features of consciousness. They are as idealized as any other abstractions, like justice or a perfect square. They're not found in reality. But they clarify features of reality and provide a standard with which to compare. While such abstractions make certain attitudes and experiences possible, they're not themselves attitudes or experiences, except insofar as we include any kind of mental activity as experience, as something that we internally do. But as concepts, not objects, they do remain empty, so they're non-concretizable. Importantly, I think not fulfillable in intuition, unless we're including reflection on the mind's own contents. So I know you have a lot you're thinking about, or I hope you do, but I'm going to talk a little bit about Pat. So Pat Stokes discusses the story in Sickness Unto Death of the peasant who fails to recognize his own legs in new stockings. One of my favorite stories. And he concludes that implicit self-awareness ought to be part of all experience. This occurs in part B of Sickness Unto Death, as Anticlimacus shifts the discussion to the role of consciousness in despair. Yet, even before the introduction of consciousness, the focus of the text has already been identity, which remains a theme when activity and passivity come to be distinguished. That is, the peasant suffers from passive despair and is unwilling to be himself. And so it seems plausible this could be resolved by adding a little more active commitment, as if Kierkegaard were urging us toward an Aristotelian golden mean, a little willingness to be oneself, but not too much. But of course, that's not how dialectic works. What the peasant lacks is not the discovery of a particular halfway point between two extremes, but a self that is nothing in particular at all. What Anticlimacus calls a naked abstract self. As with a healthy body in a draft, the naked abstract self survives changes and resolves conflicting appearances into a unified synthesis. Anticlimacus describes this capacity for a self, which the one in passive despair lacks, as, quote, consciousness of a self that is won by infinite abstraction from every externality. When passivity is the problem, this means abstraction, oddly, is the solution. Rather than decisive action, commitment, and concrete actuality, a mental act of abstracting from concreteness is called for. Now, in discussing the passage above and the naked abstract self, I notice that Stokes almost always abbreviates Anticlimacus' description. So not naked abstract self, but just naked self. Leaving out, if I am right, the most important part. Stokes, by contrast, views the naked self as a specific power of acting. So it's that unrelenting pull that Dahlstrom mentioned. That is so concrete, it even has temporal existence, a real moment in time, though perhaps too small to be noticed. Stokes names John Davenport's view of a merely imaginary abstract self, by contrast, as a view with which he disagrees. Though he notes that Michel Koch also argues, like Davenport, that the moment of choice is not even potentially introspectable. But Stokes, by contrast, insists on a particular temporal, though again perhaps extremely short, moment of transition, looking to Judge Williams' account in either or for support. But the judge's description offers at least as much evidence for the view I'm presenting here, which is that the pure self is an abstraction produced by the mind, not a concrete, even short-lived moment in time. So Williams writes, "In choosing myself, I separate myself from my relations to the whole world, until in this separation, I end in an abstract identity." So Pat interprets this as a real moment of isolation in which we ought not to remain for long. I think instead it's more reasonable to think of the abstract self as something one never is, even for a short time. That would be a kind of category mistake, is what I'm suggesting. Again, instead something I produce. So if I'm right that this core self is an abstraction, the mistake that worries Kierkegaard would be in wrongly thinking I can be the self at all, for any length of time, rather than, as Stokes claims, for dwelling there too long. On my view, abstraction is not something to be shortened, but a mental activity that is a permanent formal condition for any concrete act of choosing at all. Only if I am always, in some sense, distinct from my temporal existence, or as Kant might say, if I'm at some level aware of my autonomy and difference from nature, am I able to choose with all the weight of eternity, though it is always something concrete that I choose. This realization, I think, contra Stokes, is most likely to happen through abstract reflection. And it does not matter much how long this work of reflection takes. But any amount of trying to be this, even for a split second, or thinking one is it at all, is a misunderstanding. Yet, while Stokes acknowledges that the moment of distinctness may be infinitesimally small, that's a quote from him, infinitesimally small, he's unwilling to let go of some temporal duration. And in fact, he thinks we have an ethical responsibility to minimize its duration. As he puts it, stalling there only compounds the subject's guilt. So this makes, I believe, the naked abstract self into the wrong kind of thing. If it can exist in any places or times, even very, very small ones, it can't be everywhere and at all times in the way Kierkegaard needs it to be, for example, for contemporaneity. So in rejecting the possibility that the naked abstract self is merely an abstraction, lacking concrete or what he calls phenomenal content, Stokes appeals to Dan Zahavi's book, Subjectivity and Selfhood. But interestingly, to me anyway, in the section Stokes references, Zahavi is arguing not that the minimal self always has some phenomenal content, but just that it can be both abstract and real. Now, while this might sound contradictory, he means that an abstract self need not be a scientific construction, like a theoretical self, but something that really does ground the self and hold it together, arrived at, nevertheless, through inference, not through experience. It does not follow from the fact, of course, that something must be a real basis that we can experience it. Kant, after all, insists that things in themselves exist, but of course they can never be experienced. So while Stokes turns to Zahavi to distinguish the narrative self from the naked or minimal self, Zahavi in fact distinguishes 3 types of selves. In addition to the narrative option, which we're not talking about today, there are 2 different minimal selves. There's a phenomenal but implicit self, which is emphasized by Stokes, which is the pre-reflective awareness of experiences as mine. So this is going on in the background, and it's an implicit part of every single one of our experiences, meaning there are as many of those as we have experiences if they're divisible, which they're not, but you see what I mean. Now, the abstract or transcendent self, by contrast, which is introduced by Husserl and distinguished by Zahavi, is a non-experienceable subjective pole of identity, understood as holding together those different experiences, but most importantly, not being in any one of them, even implicitly. So I emphasize again that this second abstract or transcendent minimal self never appears phenomenally in any way. It is identified or composed, Husserl would say constituted, only through reflection and abstraction. Now, it doesn't surprise me that this abstract transcendent self does not strike Pat as relevant in Zahavi's discussion, because we are so used to thinking of Kierkegaard as urging attention away from abstraction and toward first personal experience. We just know in advance that that has to be the right answer. So if Husserl is saying there's a self that can only be constituted through abstraction, not contained in first personal experience, surely this is something we Kierkegaardians can safely ignore. Yet Zahavi's description of the abstract transcendent self is very Kierkegaardian, as it is not found in any single experience, but composed by the inner mental work of comparison across experiences, as the self relates to the world and itself. And so Zahavi describes it as a synthesis, by which we recognize, this is how he puts it, what retains its identity through changing experiences, end quote. Abstracting the one thing that remains the same within the plurality of experiences allows the unity of the self to first emerge as an abstraction, not unlike identifying wheels and planets as both round. As Zahavi puts it, the self cannot be given as an act transcendent identity in any single experience. So it's only by comparing across several experiences that we encounter something that retains its identity through change. The first personal component then, insofar as it's experience-based, occurs as many times as anything is experienced at all. But the work of thematically identifying the first personal invariant of mineness, is how they put it, belonging to me, as an invariant happens only through the hard work of abstraction. And most importantly, this is where I disagree with Stokes, that this invariant self is abstracted from the first personal experiences, which means it's not itself first personal, except again in the sense that all mental work is, in the sense that someone has to do it. So I disagree with this standard, seemingly uncontroversial reminder that we ought to ask first personal concrete questions rather than third personal metaphysical ones. I think instead, we ought to become persons who understand, through careful reflective work, the difference between a self and its appearances. Such a distinction has obvious ethical value. It allows us to view others dialectically in two registers at once, as temporal and eternal, visible and invisible, as synthesis. We're capable of making these kinds of distinctions through the hard, sometimes tedious work of dialectic. Now, I certainly don't wish to underestimate the dangers of reflection and abstraction. So Anticlimacus writes the following: Christianly understood, every poetic existence is sin. The sin of poetizing instead of being, of relating to the good and the true through the imagination instead of being that. That is, existentially striving to be that. The poet existence has a conception of God, but is exceedingly dialectical, and is as if an impenetrable dialectical labyrinth. So dialectic, at least too much of it, is a serious problem. Anticlimacus describes the ethical, moreover, as what, quote, does not abstract from actuality, but immerses itself in actuality, end quote. So I have read Kierkegaard, I know about all this. Even a useful abstraction can become hypostasized, or, as Anticlimacus puts it, becomes God. But none of this means Anticlimacus is warning us away from dialectic, abstraction, or concepts altogether, any more than the passage I just read warns us away from poetry and imagination, which I think we'd be less likely to conclude, even though it's in the passage in the same amount. The abstract entity in question is a particular one. In this context, it's the crowd that he's worried about. So humanity treated as a group or a race, where the group is a species, and that species is thought to overcome the problems of individuals. as if quantity could solve a qualitative problem. By participating in that abstraction, Anti-Climacus writes, the individual fancies that he has everything as a matter of course. But being a human being is not like being an animal, for which the specimen is always less than the species. But the error of confusing the individual with the species should not be taken to stand in for all of metaphysics. In fact, most Greek and medieval metaphysics is aimed at preparing us to distinguish these well and in very subtle contexts. Indeed, Anti-Climacus, after warning against the abstraction of the crowd, claims that the forms of despair are abstractions. He writes, the forms of despair may be arrived at abstractly by reflecting upon the constituents of which the self as a synthesis is composed. Now, none of this precludes Anti-Climacus from describing the forms of despair as if they are the experiences of individuals. He always keeps these descriptions, however, in a poetic, or again, what he calls a rhetorical mode. These are not what real existing people do, think, or feel when they are in these forms. But a poet can fill in the abstract form by creating a character to go with it. So Anti-Climacus writes that the state of a person in despair can be described directly, as the poet in fact does by giving him lines to speak. And he obligingly goes on a few pages later to create some lines. But these fictional fillings in are guided by the dialectical concepts, not the other way around. They're not guided by empirical actuality. While there are plenty of passages in Sickness Unto Death and elsewhere in which Kierkegaard raises concerns about abstraction, he does not deny it is an essential tool and even a component of selfhood. I have argued that, like despair, reflection is a case where the root of the problem is also the cure. We do not get through it by doing less of it but more, or by replacing it with images or something else which has its own problems. So I don't mean that abstract reflection either is simply better than concrete action. But if we disparage the difficult work of philosophical abstraction, replacing it with the seemingly safer spaces of concrete action and situatedness, as is tempting in Kierkegaard studies and continental philosophy more widely, we leave behind the metaphysical resources we need to develop the naked abstract self, described by Anti-Climacus and emphasized by Stokes. Though against his view again, I've argued the abstract self does not have experienceable content. In this way, I've aimed to preserve a role for metaphysical reflection in Kierkegaard's thought. Thank you.
My name is Dan Conway. I'm here to present an excerpt from an ongoing research project in which I attempt to take Kierkegaard's diagnosis, an account, philosophical account of despair, and apply it across other genres. In my undergraduate courses on film, I used the diagnosis of despair in order to make sense of certain elements of film noir, for example. Today I'm going to be talking about two representative works in the genre of the philosophical novel. I'll be looking at Kafka's The Concluding Chapters of the Trial, and I'm also going to be looking at J.M. Coetzee's novel Elizabeth Costello. I hope these will be familiar to you. If they're not, I have some notes on the slides that'll help you to see what I'm doing. Essentially, I'm interested in applying and mobilizing Kierkegaard's diagnosis of despair in order to come to what I would call a more sympathetic understanding of what it means to be in the grip of despair. The sympathetic part, I think, is largely lacking from what we get in The Sickness Unto Death, but I don't think it has to remain that way. So I've got some slides I'm going to be showing you, and I'll also be reading from the manuscript itself. Just to get started, this is how I'm going to be understanding and treating despair. I consider this to be consistent with what Kierkegaard is up to. We can argue about details. I do want to emphasize that it is a sickness of a spiritual nature. I also want to take very seriously what I believe to be Kierkegaard's understanding that the discursive element, the discursive trigger of despair is just as powerful as he claims it is. In other words, that we really could talk ourselves into a reality in which possibility comes to an end. And I have a special interest in what Kierkegaard calls defiance as a modality of despair. Aaron has tasked us with the project of talking about living in uncertainty, but I think it's far more interesting for Kierkegaard, or at least from my interpretation of Kierkegaard, to talk about living in certainty, because that's what despair delivers to you. One of the things I find really fascinating about Kierkegaard as a progenitor of depth psychology is that he has answered the question why anyone would voluntarily subscribe to a self-defeating or otherwise degrading narrative. The answer is right here because of what, as Kierkegaard shows us, the narrative that we tell about ourselves and having forfeited various potentialities is a narrative that provides us with a sense of security, a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose and direction. I talk about dark authenticity. I take very seriously Kierkegaard's notion that this is a genuine experience of authenticity. It is not sustainable, but while it is ongoing, it is equally valuable to any other experience of authenticity that one might have. So this is another thing that I find fascinating about him, is that he, his pseudonym is not sympathetic, but Kierkegaard, I take it, is very sympathetic to those who would make a bold move in defiance toward a life of dark authenticity. And finally, I'm hoping to excavate the narcissism that lies at the very heart of dark authenticity, that individuals who are otherwise unable to stabilize their lives or to align their lives in a proper way are now able to see themselves at the center of the cosmos. It's not a pretty place to be, but it is a place that makes them feel very special, very chosen. Here's my specific research question. Essentially, what is the appeal of overtly degrading narratives, such as those that emphasize the non-negotiable persistence of failure, limitation, exclusion, guilt, sinfulness, shame, vice, and other negative destinies? How is it possible to derive an artificial experience of dignity, predicated on an experience of power, freedom, authenticity, uniqueness, from an overtly degrading, undignified narrative about oneself? And as I've said, I take Kierkegaard to have answered this question in a profound way. And here's the thesis I'll be pursuing, having to do with, in particular, with the modality of despair that expresses itself as defiance. And it's the last point that I'll be talking about with respect to the two novels, that both Kafka and Coetzee have figured this part out and have taken forward Kierkegaard's insight into the need for a theatrical or a spectacular setting in which one's defiance can be fully expressed. This is what I want to look at. I choose other genres depending on what I'm doing. As I said, I like the film noir genre as well. But I'm going to be looking at the final chapter of The Trial and Coetzee's 2003 novel, Elizabeth Costello. I'll get to him in a second. Kierkegaard's readers have found much to appreciate in The Sickness Unto Death. His analysis not only names and diagnoses a heretofore elusive spiritual affliction, but also explains why those who find themselves in its grip mistakenly regard it as their non-negotiable lot in life. As Kierkegaard, or Anticlimacus, explains, the remedy for despair actually lies in an intensification of its symptoms, such that one eventually comes to renounce the misaligned self in which one's despair is rooted. Indeed, his assurances of a road to recovery, of a thoroughfare to faith that is forever open to all, are apparently meant to offer hope to those readers who are all too well versed in the suffocating rhythms of spiritual suffering. Of particular interest on this occasion is Kierkegaard's astute diagnosis of the defiance that is manifested by those miserable selves who regard and come to cherish their despair as constitutive of their identity. While acknowledging their besetting affliction, defiant selves double down on their despair, seizing it as a badge of honor, distinction, and even election. While other sufferers may avail themselves of the wondrous thoroughfare to faith, they, the defiant ones, must remain behind. Although the sickness unto death will run its inexorable course, or so they claim to have realized, it will continue to endow them with the dignity to which they proudly and defiantly cling. Like Prometheus bound to the promontory, but with no Heracles in sight, these misaligned selves derive an experience of freedom and agency from their expressions of defiance. The sickness unto death is also admired by Christians and non-believers alike for its clinical investigation of the psychological depths of spiritual distress. While it is true that Anticlimacus develops Kierkegaard's diagnosis within the context of a distinctly and unapologetically Christian treatment of sin and salvation, the structure and elaboration of this diagnosis are widely received as applicable outside this context. One need not believe in God or the redemptive power of faith in order to appreciate Kierkegaard's profile of these desperate selves who freely assent to an identity predicated on the renunciation of their freedom. Indeed, anyone who is interested in the depth psychological analysis of persistent neuroses and psychoses, that is, of meaning-conferring narratives that bear no correspondence to external states of affairs, those will profit from Kierkegaard's insights into the plight of those individuals who, desperate for a stable experience of their own authentic identity, defiantly embrace self-limiting narratives of their own design and maintenance. As we proceed, in fact, I will restrict my focus to part one of the sickness unto death, wherein Anticlimacus is primarily concerned to develop his psychological profile of selves in despair. At the same time, however, the sickness unto death can be coldly analytical in its clinical detachment from the despair diagnosis. Part of the problem lies with the author and narrator, whom Kierkegaard has conjured for the occasion. Unlike some of the other pseudonymous authors into whom Kierkegaard breathes life, Anticlimacus is noticeably terse and economical in his formulations, manifesting no enthusiasm or talent for the lyrical digressions produced by Johannes di Silencio, or the dialectical counterfactuals proposed by Victor Aremita, or the speculative adventures favored by Johannes Climacus. Anticlimacus presents himself as the consummate clinician cum scholar. When Anticlimacus explains, for example, that the self in despair, and here I'm quoting, is always only building castles in the air, is only shadow boxing, he is of course correct. At the same time, however, he comes across as incurious about and unsympathetic to the plight of the self in question. So too when he reminds his readers of the thoroughfare that leads, supposedly, from despair to faith. If only the despairing selves in question could muster the courage to become the selves they are meant to be. From Anticlimacus, in short, Kierkegaard's readers learn that the misaligned self comes to embrace its misalignment, but they do not learn why or how a misaligned self comes into secure possession of a fiction it has played a role in creating. In short, the interiority of despair, the terror, the longing, resignation, fear, defiance, and so on, remains something of a mystery, almost as if that were Kierkegaard's intent all along. And now we can air my grievances against Anticlimacus. As a result, Kierkegaard's readers must assume for themselves a greater share of the creative and imaginative labor involved in appreciating and mobilizing his insights. In particular, Kierkegaard's readers are obliged to summon or provide a credible illustration of the experience, and so of the interiority, of those who find themselves caught in the vortex of despair. In doing so, Kierkegaard's readers will involve themselves in a poetic exercise that is disconcertingly similar to the world-building activity that he associates in his diagnosis with the intensification of despair. Indeed, it is tempting to consider the possibility that Kierkegaard chose to employ anticlimacus precisely so that his readers would be obliged to develop a sympathetic identification with the world-building efforts of souls in despair. For my contribution to this illustration, I will discuss a relatively recent attempt to revisit and update the parable called Before the Law, which Kafka first published in 1915 and later incorporated into the penultimate chapter of The Trial. The attempt in question appears in and as the final chapter of Coetzee's 2003 novel titled Elizabeth Costello, where we find the titular character suspended in an unidentified liminal zone somewhere between life and death. As she struggles to comply, or not, with the demand for an account of her life, Costello manifests both forms of the despair, the so-called feminine and the so-called masculine, as described by Anticlimacus. Now I get to skip all the Kierkegaard stuff because you know it better than I do. The novel Elizabeth Costello tracks the final fading years of its central titular character. At one time a literary figure of regional influence, Elizabeth Costello spends her retirement lecturing on cruise ships to distracted and tipsy passengers who think they wish to be reminded of their misplaced love of literature. Well aware of the farce that her life has become, but unable to plot a different course for herself, Costello engages in extended reminiscences, hoping to find the thread that connects her current state of decline to what she remembers as her more vibrant and passionate youth. For those who are unfamiliar with Coetzee's novels, this is his distinctive métier as an author. He is a canny chronicler of the late modern condition, which he consistently describes as characterized by collapsing ideals, fading dreams, unrealized expectations, and a palpable but not yet alarming dissipation of passion and vitality. The characters whom he creates and prompts have all but surrendered their will to live, their will to project themselves into an identifiable future. Yet they are curiously unable to manufacture what we might expect to be the outrage or the regret to which they are entitled. They tend to go gentle into the good night that awaits them. Usually, Coetzee is concerned with a distinctly male or masculinist variation on this theme, as late middle-aged men of fading sexual potency and waning animal magnetism struggle to navigate a world that is increasingly unimpressed with what they have to offer. In the novel Elizabeth Costello, Coetzee tries his hand at creating a similarly remaindered female character, who struggles to bring a meaningful close to a life that she increasingly suspects to have been less meaningful than she had once hoped or even believed. Costello is presented to us as an Australian writer of some note, the author of the novel The House on Eccles Street, in which she tells the parallel story of Molly Bloom, the wife of Leopold Bloom, who is in turn the central character of Ulysses. As the novel Elizabeth Costello opens, the central character has just completed an exhausting journey from Australia to central Pennsylvania, where she is meant to receive an award for her lifetime contribution to Australasian literature. She proceeds to give a lackluster, off-key acceptance speech, which confirms that she has lost her edge as a writer and a speaker. 2 years later, in another speech to another U.S. audience, her dreadful performance causes her to wonder if she ever maintained that edge at all. Suffering what appears to be a late-in-life existential crisis, she has become estranged from what she understands to have been her defining beliefs. The final chapter of the novel is titled At the Gate, and it is here that Coetzee spoils for an engagement with Kafka. As the chapter title suggests, Coetzee wishes to divert our focus ever so slightly from the mysterious radiant law described by Kafka to the opaque and coldly material gate that is suggestive, but only suggestive of what lies beyond it. The man from the country, as described by the priest to Joseph K., may be transfixed and perhaps even beatified by the law, but Elizabeth Costello is focused on the unimpressive gate, which may or may not afford access to the meaning and redemption that her mortal existence apparently requires. This is not to say that Costello inoculates herself against the kinds of projective anthropomorphisms that bind the man from the country to the law. As we shall see, her own allegiance to the impersonal gate is similarly vulnerable to the rush of fancy and poetic speculation. As in Kafka's parable, the gate or portal is meant to be emblematic of a final test or trial. This is Judgment Day for Elizabeth Costello, and it gradually dawns on her that she must participate actively and on her own behalf to make a case for her passage to whatever it is that lies beyond this gate. In other words, she realizes that her lifetime achievements, failures, hopes, aspirations, friendships, and betrayals, what we might call her body of work as a human being, is not sufficient. A case must be made. A narrative must be constructed if she is to pass through the gate. One might think that Costello is uniquely positioned to ace this particular test. She is a writer, after all, a patient observer and a clever wordsmith. She is adept and practiced at breathing narrative life into characters who had little or no antecedent history. In other words, her statement of belief could attest to the life she has lived, much as her best-loved novel brought structure, order, and punctuation to the rambling soliloquy of Molly Bloom. Remarkably, however, she refuses to participate in this, her final trial and test. Coetzee's readers may be reminded of a similar refusal on the part of David Lurie, the odious protagonist of the novel Disgrace, who hijacks an administrative inquiry into his predatory behavior so that he might recast himself as a victim. Coetzee does not dwell on the point, and neither does Costello, but the scene in question helpfully illuminates the gratuitous cruelty that is encoded in this particular version of the Day of Judgment. As it turns out, one's future rests not entirely on the overall quality of the life one has lived, which presumably someone associated with the judgment apparatus has been monitoring, but also on the quality of one's final statement. It is to this final, unannounced requirement I wish to suggest that Elizabeth Costello directs her refusal. She is prepared, if not entirely eager, to be judged for the life she has lived, but she will not submit to a judgment of her own summary evaluation of the life that she has lived. This she will keep to herself, a secret she will shelter, even at the risk of failing to secure passage to the other side. What makes her refusal so odd is that she is well known for holding and stating any number of estimable beliefs. In her train wreck of a speech in Massachusetts, for example, she piously seizes the moral high ground to denounce the eating and mistreatment of animals. As she admits, moreover, she holds these beliefs so strongly that she cannot mount a persuasive argument in their defense. The justice of her own commitment to animal welfare advocacy is so bracingly clear to her that she cannot make or even seek common ground with those who might require an argument to be persuaded. Why then does she not simply recite a statement of these beliefs? What gatekeeper in this or any world would deny passage to a tofu-fueled champion of defenseless and voiceless animals? Given what she believes is going on, her refusal to comply with the request is certainly understandable and perhaps righteous. After all, who are these minor officials? Indeed, who is anyone to stand in judgment of her? But why does she believe what she believes about where she is and what is going on? She has arrived by bus at a nondescript, vaguely provincial, Italianesque way station. In order to continue her journey, she must pass through the gate, which will be open for her only if she provides the requested statement of belief. Had she complied promptly, she might already be on her way again, if that is what she wishes or intends. Had she done so promptly, she might have arrived already at the next way station, where a similar request may have been made of her. Rather than treat the statement of belief as a minor bureaucratic nuisance, for example, as a kind of transit visa or customs declaration, she refuses to comply and proceeds to manufacture the appropriate level of outrage at having been asked to do so. As Kierkegaard via Anticlimacus discloses, however, refusal should not be confused with disengagement. In the case of Elizabeth Costello, refusal manifests itself as an intensification of engagement, that is, as an acknowledgement of the validity of the law with which she refuses to comply. Like the man from the country, that is, Elizabeth Costello initially manifests what Anticlimacus identifies as the feminine form of despair. Her temporizing strategy is her way of not willing to be herself. Her existential crisis has given way to the sickness unto death. I'm going to move now to a discussion of Kafka. In the penultimate chapter of The Trial, entitled In the Cathedral, Kafka introduces his readers to a priest who wishes to disabuse Joseph K. of the delusion under which he currently operates. In refusing the priest's offers of assistance, K. is characteristically defiant, insisting that he remains the best judge of his current situation and of the options available to him. According to K., the assistance he seeks with his case, which the priest immediately dismisses as not the right kind of help, will suffice to yield the resolution he awaits. What is both odd and yet typically Kafkaesque, I had to say it, about this scene is that K is simultaneously drawn to the priest's offer of help and categorically dismissive of it. Finding comfort or familiarity in the liminal space between freedom and fate, he neither submits to the priest nor walks away. He is both arrested by the prospect of redemption and yet categorically opposed to the suggestion that his current efforts are unproductive. Excuse me. Unable to persuade K to consider the possibility that his case is going badly, the priest resorts to indirect communication in the form of a parable, which is commonly known as before the law. The parable relates the situation of an unnamed man from the country who seeks admittance to the law. Although his reasons for doing so are never revealed, we apparently are meant to understand that the man from the country wishes to petition the law, or its guardians, if such exist, for a judgment of his life and or soul, perhaps as a condition of attaining a peaceful embrace of his mortality or of gaining a particular placement in the afterlife. As the plight of K suggests, the man from the country wishes to know if he is to be pronounced guilty or innocent. We apparently are meant to understand, moreover, that this is a matter of grave importance to the man from the country who has traveled far to receive the judgment that awaits him. When the man from the country petitions the doorkeeper for admittance, he is told that his request cannot be granted at this time. Informed that his petition may be considered at a later time, the man from the country takes up what turns out to be permanent residence at the side of the door. Despite his belief that the law should be accessible to every man and at all times, he decides that he had better wait until he gets permission to enter. Thus we glimpse in the man from the country the despair that K is meant by the priest to see in himself. In both cases, a perfectly understandable request for clarity, for a credible judgment of one's life or soul, is displaced by a sudden upsurge of contentment with a situation that is admittedly unacceptable, but familiar nonetheless. In both cases, that is, an eminently worthy goal or objective, namely, to know where one stands in the supposed grander order, is imperceptibly replaced by the distinctly less heroic goal of waiting until anonymous others deign, or not, to provide the judgment to which one has asserted one's title. Responding to what he's been told by the doorkeeper, the man from the country is content to live out his days in proximity to the law, awaiting but never receiving the judgment he claims to seek. While it is true that he is persistent in petitioning the doorkeeper for admittance, it is also true that he readily accepts the doorkeeper's serial refusals. And although he attempts unsuccessfully to bribe the doorkeeper, the man from the country never threatens, much less delivers, the kind of violence or reprisal that one might think to commit in the name of justice. Through it all, his attempts to gain admittance to the law remain modest, respectful, and only timidly transgressive. He will not enter the envisioned sanctum until or unless he receives permission to do so. Although he occasionally curses his evil fate aloud, he at no time curses the law itself, which he apparently regards as having lawfully barred him from admittance. Nor, we might add, does he ever retreat in anger or withdraw his petition to be granted admittance to the law. If anything, he shifts the focus of his attention from the law to the doorkeeper, who becomes for him a subject of careful observation and creative speculation. Indeed, the companionship of this aloof doorkeeper has become the compensatory source of meaning for his curious existence. This part I'm sure you all know. As he approaches the end of his days, the man from the country begins to perceive the law as a mystical source of light, which emanates outward from the forbidden portal. Buoyed perhaps by the radiance streaming toward and over him, he finally manages to launch the question with which he might or should have prefaced his initial petition. Everyone strives to attain the law, answers the man, but how does it come about that in all these years no one has come seeking admittance but me? Poised to deliver the long-awaited twist on the priest's parable, the doorkeeper explains, "No one but you could gain admittance through this door, since this door was intended for you. I am now going to shut it." Confirming the diagnosis of despair, the doorkeeper alerts the man from the country to his own role in designing a juridical apparatus from which he would be barred. What we now see is that the spiritual sickness of despair has the effect of postponing indefinitely a determinative judgment of one's life or soul, while also inuring one to the compensatory benefits that accrue, supposedly, to those who await a judgment that will never arrive. What did the priest hope to convey by means of the parable he related to Joseph K.? While the scholarship on this point is rich and varied, several themes stand out as particularly relevant to the case of Kay, and so to the related case of Elizabeth Costello. And here's the interpretation. Despite knowing almost nothing about the law, the man from the country proceeds with his petition as if he were fully informed of his prospects. More disturbingly, he decides on his own that his proximity to the law will suffice in place of the judgment he will not receive. The true servant of the law, he has surmised, is distinguished not by his demand to receive the judgment that is rightfully his, but by his patience and deference before the law itself. There may be an additional problem with the parable the priest has related. Gets us back to Joseph K. As described, the man from the country is noticeably polite, meek, and compliant. While it is true that he occasionally mutters to himself and bemoans his fate, he is largely accepting of the serial deferrals he receives. Although the doorkeeper describes him in his dotage as insatiable, this evaluation is presumably meant as either ironic or hyperbolic. If anything, the man from the country is too easily sated. He may have made a pest of himself in the eyes of the doorkeeper, but as a petitioner of the law, he is anything but demanding. If Joseph K. has fixed his attention on the timidity and the quiet suffering of the man from the country, it is likely that he finds the parable to be irrelevant to his situation. Although K. plays an active role in conjuring a juridical apparatus from which he believes himself to be barred, which is likely the primary point of comparison the parable is meant to drive home, he does not take lightly the legal proceedings in which he believes himself to be enmeshed. Vowing regularly to get to the bottom of the matter, fully prepared to knock on doors and hurl threats as needed, Joseph K. may interpret his expressions of defiance as separating him decisively from the man from the country. That he habitually fails to follow up on his expressions of defiance is an element of his story that he either does not see or refuses to acknowledge. Indeed, even though his outcome and eventual demise are prefigured in the parable, his contempt for the weakness of the man from the country may blind him to any potentially productive lessons to be derived from the comparison the parable was meant to suggest. Back to Elizabeth Costello. What I do in this next section, which I won't read, is chart the movement from what Anticlimacus has called feminine despair to masculine despair. Eventually, Elizabeth Costello resolves to produce the required statement, wherein she claims to hold no beliefs of her own. Borrowing the designation proposed by the Polish poet Czesław Miłosz, she introduces herself to her tribunal as a secretary of the invisible. which she understands to be a kind of writer who aspires to a posture of stringent, self-neutralizing objectivity. She has no beliefs, she explains, because she is well practiced in the discipline required of her by her profession of emptying herself of any content that might diminish or complicate her efforts to channel the voices and stories of those whom she serves. Although she has decided to comply with the requirement imposed on those petitioners who wish to pass through the gate, she agrees to do so only as a representative of her chosen profession. As a unique person, an aged human being who has credibly lent her voice over the years to many beliefs, she refuses to comply. What is even more perplexing is that she refuses to acknowledge that she is anything other than, or in excess of, the dictation secretary she presents for their evaluation. Only after a good deal of prodding does she bear witness to a minimally human self, and even then she loses her auditors with a rambling, incoherent reminiscence. As she later explains to those whom she takes to be her judges, she identifies her professional self as her ideal self, even though the request made of her specified no such determination. Although Costello presents herself as clean of belief, free to channel the voices of others without prejudice or distraction, she is not free, or so she believes, or wishes to believe, to perform a similar service for herself. She thus clings to a misaligned self that values familiarity and stability over freedom, as evidenced by her impressively quaint efforts to make a new home for herself in the dreary internment-grade dormitory in which she now resides. Her persistence is made possible by her recently acquired conviction that a defiantly despairing self may aspire to a life graced by a lesser grade of nobility. Having turned herself into an inert recording device, she proudly emphasizes the quality and intensity of her service to others, as if contracting the sickness unto death were an acceptable price to pay for bringing to life the character of Molly Bloom. Like all selves that wax defiant in their despair, Costello has persuaded herself that a sufficiently meaningful life, a good or good enough life, worthwhile if not worthy of salvation, lies within her reach. In order to rationalize after the fact the bargain she has struck, she assembles the elements of the juridical apparatus in which she understands herself to be confined. As in the related cases of The Man from the Country and Joseph K., the law before which she stands is an unrecognized product of her own imagination. She has constructed and mobilized this apparatus to serve as a seemingly external confirmation of the necessity of her despair and of the lesser nobility of her defiance. It bears noting here that no one whom she encounters seconds her preferred understanding of her situation. Her so-called judges do not introduce themselves as such, and the questions they pursue are meant not to humiliate her, but to elicit the meaning, if there is any, behind her deliberately non-compliant statements of belief. She also limits her interactions with others, one suspects, so as to minimize the possibility that her preferred account of her situation will be challenged or disconfirmed. In her only recorded exchange with another petitioner, she learns that the Polish woman, she never bothers to learn this person's name, has a very different interpretation of what it means to be a petitioner before the law. Thus, we arrive at an illustration of what is perhaps Kierkegaard's most ingenious contribution to our understanding of the spiritual sickness of despair. Those who manifest their despair in expressions of defiance do so, ostensibly, with good reason and on a solid footing. What they believe is asked or expected of them is outrageous, and they are certainly right to enact the refusal. At the same time, however, the point of their expressions of righteous defiance is not to extricate them from the unfair situations in which they find themselves. What Kierkegaard helps us to understand about Joseph K. and Elizabeth Costello is that defiance is a sign not of their determination to end their despair, but of their affirmation of despair as the non-negotiable condition of the misaligned selves with which they continue, respectively, to identify. If anything, their expressions of defiance announce their prideful choice to remain who they are, even if their current identity is incompatible with the resolution of their cases. The world Costello has created in her despair is responsible in turn for remaking her in its image. Having graduated from weakness to defiance, she is now confronted with a situation that invites and eventually demands from her an impassioned response. Thus interpreted, her situation is experienced by her as an indictment or a rebuke, as if her life has been repackaged for her consideration as a trifle or a joke. As Kierkegaard observes, a self in the grip of despair takes the situation as an occasion to be offended at all existence and defiantly wills to be himself. The one-sided nature of the imagined ruse, plot, or conspiracy is crucial here, for it confirms the despairing self's conviction that she cannot prevail in any event. There can be no hint or glimpse of salvation. As Costello becomes convinced that her passage through the gate will never be granted, she becomes increasingly defiant of the authority figures who stand in judgment of her. As we shall see, the despairing self is resigned to find her only consolation in the ferocity of her defiance and the concomitant experience of her own authenticity.
Now, 5 minutes.
5 minutes? Excellent. Perfect.
Well, you're 5 minutes over.
Oh, well, you should have told me that. I can wrap this up. 5 minutes. Let me wrap it up. If you've been following along with my slides, you know where we are. In apparent fidelity to Kierkegaard's diagnosis of despair, the novel Elizabeth Costello sputters to an unsatisfying, disintegrating conclusion. Elizabeth Costello inquires once again after her status, asking yet another nameless functionary if her situation, which she cannot describe even to herself, is unique. "We see people like you all the time," the functionary replies, and the lesson ends. People like her, souls in despair, secretaries of the invisible, long-term petitioners. And what does he see in her that he has seen in so many others? Are there outward signs, whether of election or damnation, of which she is unaware? And why him? Was he approached, like Sartre's confessor, for the answer she was confident he would provide? An answer that conveniently validates her strategy of indefinite deferral? Following Kafka, Coetzee depicts the experience of despair as characterized by a progressively constrictive claustrophobia, as the reticulate network of self-limiting narratives envelops and eventually entombs its defiant creator. As described by Kafka and Coetzee, despair thus amounts to a kind of living death, wherein spiritually bereft individuals experience themselves first as hostages to an absurd and vaguely cruel drama, whose lazy plot they readily discern and roundly scorn. Second, as husks of their former, if idealized selves, slowly divested of the passion, purpose, and particularity that formerly defined them. And third, as finally indifferent to any distinction they or others might have drawn between spirit and matter, or between life and death. Those who relax into the grip of despair need not die in order to experience a spiritual death, for they have already paid with their souls for the stable sense of identity to which they defiantly lay claim. For them, the difference between life and death has become both uninteresting and inconsequential. Notably, concerning in this respect is Costello's claim not to be impressed, much less drawn, by the merely brilliant light she has glimpsed on the far side of the gate. She can't even get excited about the purported afterlife. Even her death-betokening vision, namely of the sleeping dog guarding the far side of the gate, is fodder for her hypertrophic capacity for critical self-reflection. Here I quote, "She does not trust in particular the anagram God-dog, too literary," end of quote. As envisioned by Coetzee, the sickness unto death culminates in a self-consuming spasm of exceedingly clever but cruelly pointless reflection. Although we do not see her die, it is not unreasonable to conclude that Elizabeth Costello has questioned herself to death, the victim of her literary intellect turned against her. Indeed, Kierkegaard's readers may be reminded of the fate of Socrates, this is going all the way back to the dissertation, who was swept away by his own irony, or more prophetically, of those servants of leveling, as he calls them, who at the conclusion of the present age will direct the corrosive power of their critical reflection against themselves. And the final note is Here are some other victims of despair that we find in Kierkegaard's writings. Essentially, I now see despair everywhere in Kierkegaard's writings. The original, the dissertation on irony was actually about despair, and Socrates died of despair. Johannes de Silencio certainly falls into despair when he realizes that Abraham was not sheltering a secret and that Abraham had no accessible interiority that Johannes might memorialize in poetry or song. And finally, in the literary review, the agents of leveling, once they have chattered on and on, reflected on everything outside of them, they have no choice but to turn the reflection on themselves. I think this is an expression of a diagnosis, a profile of despair. Thank you very much. Sorry about the extra time.
Well, hello, I'm Hugh Piper, recently retired Yippie from the University of Sheffield, and as usual, feeling a distinct interloper in this kind of discussion. In fact, I would never have started my paper with the first sentence I'm now about to read, had I known that I was going to be preceded by that fascinating talk by Dan. Because it says, in the world of Kierkegaard studies, I am something of an aging one-trick pony. What a Coetzee sentence. What a moment of self-revelation. But I can deal with that. You've got other things to think about. I confess that, but I still think it's a good trick that served me well, so it's worth one more outing at least. The trick is just to whisper to a bunch of philosophers, Kierkegaard did read the Bible. And to remember how significant biblical texts are as the source and stimulus for his writing. And in the context of this conference, I fell to wondering whether I could use this trick to throw any light on Kierkegaard's discussion of possibility. So I became intrigued by his famous line, God is that all things are possible. I want to explore the biblical background to that striking statement, and I will be arguing, and I am well aware that it's that very dangerous thing, an argument from silence, that it's interesting how reticent Kierkegaard is about the context. And I'll suggest that this has implications for how we in turn read this particular quotation, and that will have consequences for our understanding of what Kierkegaard is doing as he discusses possibility. The phrase, God is that all things are possible, is never found in the Bible. However, it does have a clear precursor in Jesus' assurance to his disciples that all things are possible with God. Now that's both similar and very different. You'll find that phrase in all three of the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in the context of the discussion Jesus has with his disciples after he has encountered what Luke at least calls a wealthy young man. Now, this isn't a paper in New Testament studies where we could spend many happy hours discussing the reasons behind the subtle differences between the three different gospel writers in their presentation of this story. But I do want to give you a little bit of context. The whole thing is a very puzzling episode that's raised a number of problems over the centuries. You can go right back to the earliest biblical commentators and find arguments over what this implies, and indeed the three Gospels attest that different interpretations of this story are present even at that earliest moment. Basically, it's simple. A young man comes to Jesus to ask how he should gain eternal life. Jesus tells him to keep the commandments, which the young man claims to have done from his youth. Jesus then tells him one thing is lacking. He should sell all he has and give to the poor, and then follow Jesus. The young man goes away sad. because he has many possessions. Jesus then turns to his disciples and exclaims how hard it will be for the wealthy to enter the kingdom of heaven, using the celebrated comparison of a camel going through the eye of a needle. The disciples, already perturbed at what's going on, then ask, "But who then can be saved?" The title of my paper. The reaction is intriguing. You could well imagine that the disciples, who, as Peter goes on to protest, have already given up everything to follow Jesus, could be betrayed into a self-satisfied sense of their own privileged position when it comes to salvation. They've already done what the young man was reluctant to do. They're not the wealthy who are debarred from the kingdom, surely, but instead they ask, who then can be saved? The implication is that the young man isn't a special case, but an example of a universal impossibility of salvation. It's at this point that Jesus rejoins, "For mortals it's impossible, but not for God. For God, all things are possible." That's the basic outline, or at least it is in Matthew and Mark. Those two Gospels vary in very minor details, but Luke's version does change the story in subtle ways. It's in his version that the questioner is introduced not just as a young man, but as a certain ruler. Told that he should sell all he has, he doesn't leave. In the other versions, he goes, because Jesus tells him, go. Not in Luke's. Jesus addresses to him in particular, not to the crowd in general, but to him in particular, the metaphor of the camel and the needle. It's not a general statement in Luke. And the response, "Who then can be saved?" comes not from the disciples, but from those who heard it. Luke takes the focus off the disciples. A standard interpretation of this would be that Luke, or whoever relayed this story to him, has already become troubled by the implications of making this a universally applicable story. The man's a ruler, not just anybody. Jesus' speech about camels is for him, not for the rest of us. The general consternation is not for the disciples, who do a protest again. Well, we have given up everything, but this unspecified group of those who happen to hear. We can already see in the text itself that this story is a cause of offense. The disciples are offended, and Luke, or Luke's line of transmission, has had a problem with this story. The reader of this story is kind of doubly offended. First, at the implication that salvation for everyone, including the reader, depends on divesting oneself of worldly possessions. And second, that this requirement extends to the apostles, who would have already seemed to have done this. That seems like adding insult to injury. If even the apostles have this problem, what about us, who can be saved? And Luke's version is the beginning of a trend to soften this scandal, to weaken this demand by making it applicable to a specific subset of the human race, the rich, thus giving the reader a way of deflecting its force. After all, we can always content ourselves with the thought that there's somebody who's richer than we are. I mean, obviously, who's being talked about is Donald Trump, for instance. I mean, we're not rich. Well, it's people poorer than us, but rich. Surely nobody would expect that of us. And the history of interpretation of this story through the Christian centuries shows a number of ingenious moves being made to evade the implications of a reading that would see this as a universal requirement. In reviewing this, I'm depending a lot on a very interesting paper by David Fink. One strand of interpretation tries to undo the scandal by vilifying the questioner. Very early in the tradition, actually, it is claimed that the young man's question is not animated by genuine desire to be saved, but in order to trip up Jesus. Like many other questions asked by Pharisees, projected as, oh, well, he's there trying to trick Jesus. Doesn't really care about his own salvation. And so he certainly deserves this crushing rebuke. That's hard to square with Mark's comment that when the man replies that he has followed the commandments from the days of his youth, Jesus, looking upon him, loved him. Only Mark says that. Luke never says that. Another technique is to see this, as Matthew actually hints, as a counsel of perfection. Perhaps like celibacy, giving up all you own is a possibility for those with a particular vocation, but it's entirely impractical as a way for a community to survive. Even the most utopian reading of the book of Acts, for instance, has the church sharing everything in common. That's not quite the same as saying the church gave everything they had away to the poor. And it tends to be absurd anyway. I mean, if I give you, poor person, all my goods, you then become the person with all the goods, which presumably required to give them away to the next poor person that you meet. And it just becomes a bit of a waste of time. A third approach is, and this is very typical, of course, to see this all in terms of attachment rather than possession. Goes right back to Clement of Alexandria. If I live as if I would be willing to give away all my wealth, that surely comes to the same thing. I don't actually have to do it, I just know I would if anybody really required it. And because I would give away all my wealth, I can very legitimately regard myself as poor. Because I don't have anything. I would give it away at a minute's notice. Now, in the context of Danish Christianity and Kierkegaard's response to the text, it's worth examining what Luther did with this passage. It's actually a very problematic story for Luther. Of course, as you all know better than me, he was very fiercely opposed to any separation of the requirements of the law into counsels and precepts applicable only to an elect few, as opposed to you. There's some things that are for the elect few, that in the Catholic tradition, those with a religious vocation had to follow, but the rest of believers didn't have to bother with them. But Luther doesn't like that, so he can't play that one. It's also awkward that asked how one gains eternal life, Jesus seems to point to the adherence to the law as an answer. Keep the commandments. That's all Jesus said to him. And actually, here's another commandment: give away all your goods to the poor. That's works, that is. Luther doesn't really want to hear that. To counter this, Luther takes the line that the young man is simply self-deluded when he claims to have kept the law. I mean, he says he has, but he obviously can't, because Luther knows you can't. So he must be self-deluded. So that's answered him. And that's so obvious to Jesus and any good Lutheran reader that Jesus doesn't even bother to contradict him. It's quite interesting, Luther puts that in. The fact that Jesus doesn't say, well, of course you haven't kept the law. I mean, just, anybody could tell. He then goes on to explain that the problem is not the young man's wealth as such, but that he's put something before God. In God alone you should have your joy and desire, says Luther. But people do not do this. Therefore, they are all rich. But that is, before God, they are wicked and robbers. They do not put their trust in God, but in money and possessions. So he's got the old, that universal thing. That's how the universal worked. We've all put something before God. Riches are not material possessions per se, but whatever we prefer before God. As Fink explains, wealth and poverty, in other words, have become for Luther purely theological categories with virtually no connection to one's material conditions. And he sees this as a prime example, the way Luther deals with this story, of how the Reformation insistence on sola scriptura doesn't mean the end of allegorization. In some cases, it encourages it. Luther's conclusion is that, of course, you should give up your wealth if forced to by a tyrant who says your money or your faith. But in the normal course of events, God's quite happy for you to keep your wealth as long as you're using it to glorify him. Luther goes further than this. Given that God regards marriage as the norm for human life, which of course he wants to promote in the face of clerical celibacy, then God must be content that people have enough money to support and feed a family. So he can't possibly mean you to give up all your wealth. What are the implications for all this for Kierkegaard and the consideration of possibility? Well, this seems to me a case where Kierkegaard's silences are suggestive. After all, the explicit reaction of astonishment and surprise, particularly by the disciples, would seem to make this a key example of his insistence on offence as the primary category in considering the role of Scripture. The exegetical moves that Luther uses to pull the sting of the offence are precisely what Kierkegaard attacks in his more polemical demands that the plain requirements of Scripture are to be met, not evaded. When he speaks, for instance, of Scripture as a letter from the beloved, it's just such a demand from the beloved, give up all your riches, that you have to obey. You mustn't evade it. But this particular story of the rich young man very seldom features in Kierkegaard's discussion of such points. There is an exception in For Examination, where he lists a number of passages that are, quote, all too easy to understand, beginning with, give your gifts to the poor. But he immediately admits his own inability to meet the requirements, while at the same time decrying the practice of, quote, cunningly shoving in one layer after another interpretation, scholarly research, and more scholarly research, much in the way a boy puts a napkin or more under his pants when he's going to get a licking. So he's not unaware of this demand, and here is one place where he says, well, I'm just not up to this. Elsewhere, the few references to the young man in his writings confirm that he has some discomfort with what we would think ought to be his own predilection for a literal interpretation. In Fear and Trembling, Climacus contrasts the young man with Abraham. He tacitly acknowledges that we might see some parallel between the demand to renounce one's worldly wealth that the young man faced and the demand that Abraham should sacrifice his son. I mean, is there some parallel? However, Kierkegaard, Climacus, says, if that rich young man whom Jesus had met along the way had sold all his possessions and given the money to the poor, we would praise him as we praise every great deed, even if we could not understand him without working. But he still would not become an Abraham, even though he sacrificed the best. What is omitted from Abraham's story is the anxiety, because to money I have no ethical obligation, but to the Son the Father has the highest and holiest. The young man, yeah, fine, give away your wealth, but you're not Abraham. In this way, Kierkegaard, I think, has a very interesting exegetical move. of reducing the offence by comparing this unfavourably to an even more extreme requirement. So in a more extended discussion in the Gospel of Sufferings, what meaning and joy is there in following Christ, Kierkegaard acknowledges the demand, but manages to deflect some of the scandal by insisting it's not enough. He points out that the young man is asked by Jesus not just to sell what he has, but also to take up his cross and follow him. Giving all to the poor is only the beginning. The real test is the constant self-denial of carrying one's cross. We might not even admire the young man if he did give everything up, but pity him as a fool, says Kierkegaard. The point is not the magnitude of the sacrifice you make in order to take up the cross, but that you continue to carry it. Now that actually is quite a cunning way of sidelining the problem caused by the renunciation of wealth. In the grand scheme of things, it's a bit trivial. I mean, the real point would be, have you taken up your cross? And don't go boasting about the fact you gave up your wealth, because that's really rather trivial. And in fact, there's almost an implication it would be a very un-Danish example of theatricality to renounce one's wealth publicly. I mean, that would be kind of vain, wouldn't it? Oh, look at me, I renounce my wealth to follow the cross. No, just follow the cross. This denigration of such a renunciation is summed up in a couple of sentences from Without Authority. Shall I give all my possessions to the poor? No, you shall first seek the kingdom of God. Interestingly sidelined it. Kierkegaard does not rule out the possibility of giving up one's goods. It has to be done for the right reasons, and also in full realization that it contributes nothing to winning salvation, because that depends solely on grace. Elsewhere, Kierkegaard's attitude to wealthy Christians in a wider scheme seems to approach that of Luther. In the Christian discourse entitled The Care of Abundance, Kierkegaard argues that the rich Christian becomes ignorant of his wealth and therefore is permitted to retain it. This discourse is immediately preceded by the care of poverty, and it turns out that the answer to both forms of care is exactly the same. The Christian is the only one who is truly poor and truly rich at the same time. And the teachers of this are, of course, the famous lily and the bird. The person who is aware of either his poverty or his wealth is living in an anxiety of uncertainty, because wealth will come and go in a moment. It's uncontrollable. The thing is not to be aware of it. Now, the bird is ignorant of its wealth and doesn't know what it's got. It's just primarily and primitively ignorant. The good Christian becomes ignorant. That's the difference. So it's not an accident. You might be wondering, well, where am I going with all this? It's not an accident that the phrase we began with, God is all things are possible, has its roots in a story that is basically based on a discussion about wealth, actual material possessions. Going back to David Fink, he says, Protestant theology has all too often been willing to theorize the drama of human redemption in abstraction from the material conditions of life, especially the economic and environmental conditions. As we've seen, the history of interpretation of this story bears this out, and Kierkegaard can't be quite exonerated from it. To conclude that in the end rich and poor Christians are exactly the same might be interpreted as an endorsement of any unequal economic status quo. Now, to be fair to Kierkegaard, he doesn't claim to be any great model in this. But I want to consider the fact that the recent turn that we've seen to looking at the bearing of economic and environmental conditions on Kierkegaard's thought and the relevance of his writing to contemporary critical engagement with economics and politics is particularly pertinent in the discussion of uncertainty certainty and possibility. People could say all sorts of things about economics and justice, the relationship between the spiritual and material, the anxiety of living uncertainty. The real test is to see what they do with their own money. Now, this is a particular relevance for an aged one-trick pony. I'm now in the happy position of being a pensioner. I prudently laid aside money while I was working in order to ensure that I have what I consider an acceptable standard of living for the remaining years of my life, however long they may be. Given a family history that includes a number of nonagenarians and centenarians, that might be a while. But there is, of course, no assurance, and there is no money. All my contributions paid for the pensions of those older than I am. And those of you who are British taxpayers or members of the USS are paying for me, and thank you very much. But the point is, a pension is an attempted answer to the question that Kierkegaard returns to again and again in the discourses of the cares of the pagans. Care of the pagan is, what shall we eat or what shall we drink tomorrow? Now you can spiritualize that, but it's actually a very real question. And what am I going to do with my pension? And, well, I'm not even going to talk about Brexit. What shall we eat on the 1st of November? The anxiety of the possibility that tomorrow there may be no food or drink, or of ill health, other factors may prevent us gaining our sustenance, is what is being focused on here. The lily and the bird are spared that anxiety because of their ignorance. The Christian, says Kierkegaard, must become ignorant. If we think in these terms, my pension is a prime example of what Kierkegaard meant when he talks in Sickness Unto Death of the Philistine bourgeois mentality that thinks it controls possibility, that it has tricked this prodigious elasticity into the trap or madhouse of probability. Now, I think that probably sums up, I'm no expert on this, sums up the whole of modern economics. It's also an example of our yearning to treat the future as if it were the past, precisely in order to reduce its unpredictability. There's a book to be written on the way in which modern economics is based on what Kierkegaard would call living backwards. When we look at markets in futures and on credit, living now on the promise of payment from the future. The problem is, as Kierkegaard says, we have to live forwards. We inexorably travel into the future. When we get there, we may find that we've already consumed it. Kierkegaard's uncharacteristic reluctance to engage directly with what he admits is a clear command in the gospel to sell all and give to the poor may betray the anxiety that's clear throughout his journals over his own financial position. We know that he lived well on his father's bequest, as long as that lasted, but also towards the end of his life he was aware that his funds were dwindling. His own capacity to earn anything, never all that great, was ever more limited. The one obvious possibility, retirement to a country parish, depended on the goodwill of the bishop and his own physical strength, and both of those were hardly reliable. But in extremis, the lack of possibility becomes a strength. In the end, he had less and less to lose by opposing the church. Now, I don't have a conclusion here, really. It ill behoves us, and certainly me, to sit in judgment on Kierkegaard on all this. The point I want to leave with you comes from a dictum of the Christian philosopher and Bible translator Heinz Cassirer, who was wont to say, "The kingdom of heaven demands the whole of your bank account. You can't keep back 10 quid for a rainy day." But if that's what's demanded, who then can be saved?
Hello, Anna. You're now being stared at by a room full of people. I'll just direct the video camera toward them to make this feel slightly less or more awkward. I'm not sure which. We're ready when you are.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Apologies for not being present with you today. I've had some visa difficulties. So I'm currently in Canada.
I just want to say one word. If the connection ends up being bad on our end, then I'll tell you and I can continue by reading your paper, okay?
Great, thank you so much.
We'll see how it goes.
Great. My paper is entitled Kierkegaard's Possibility in an Age of Environmental Anxiety. So it's looking at the concept of anxiety and trying to read the environmental anxiety of our age with Kierkegaard's concept of anxiety. If there are two words that reverberate in the air through the cries of Extinction Rebellion, environmental bloggers, scientists, children, and farmers, is these: anxiety and limit. The current challenge to confront our limit has become fundamental to the political and social agenda, looking into economics, psychology, size matters, seats, and the urgency brings anxiety because we have been forced our limit.
Okay, Anna, it's just not a good enough connection, I'm afraid.
Okay.
Why don't I read it and then we'll bring you back in for the questions. Does that sound all right?
Thank you, Erin.
Okay.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you.
All right. Plan B in place. So, I'll just start over quickly. So, if there are two words that reverberate in the air through the cries of Extinction Rebellion, environmental bloggers and scientists, children and farmers, it is these: anxiety and limit. The current challenge to confront our limit has become fundamental to the political and social agenda, echoing into economics, psychology, and ethics. Size matters, it seems, and the urgency brings anxiety because we've been forced to face our limit. It's a limit born out of an age of limitlessness, widespread economic advancements, and a depletion of traditional agricultural biodiversity. In his book, Place, Ecology, and the Sacred, environmental ethicist Michael Northcott notes that this practice, quote, giantism, is humanly and not only ecologically destructive, end quote.
Excuse me, Erin. Can
Yes?
you somehow get the volume up?
Yes, I will bring the microphone into things. Okay, how's that? Better?
Yeah.
All right. So, giantism is humanly and ecologically destructive. Because, quote, persons depend for their flourishing on cognitive, embodied, and moral capacities, which are uniquely complex, end quote. When overruled by large-scale consumption and demolition, this complexity is lost and causes the small, aggregated sufferings that result in the trauma of current reality. But if we look at this from an existential phenomenology, the questions are not merely related to the material, but also to the existential. It's here that the infinite potential of Kierkegaard, which expresses itself from existence, rather than merely material terms, may help us to discern between the anxieties of the age. In the pseudonymous text, The Concept of Anxiety, Kierkegaard writes that anxiety is experienced as the self increasingly realizes its freedom and finitude. Anxiety, then, is not necessarily the inverse of this, but a distortion, a self-becoming experience gone wrong. In this paper, I'll suggest that Kierkegaard's infinite potential is a concept that can illuminate the contemporary experience of anxiety. Kierkegaard's individual is constantly confronted with the infinite potential entangled in its limitedness. However, the anxieties resolve not materially, but existentially, in the self that chooses to rest itself in the infinite. This paper will draw on the concept of anxiety to further develop the existential aspects of the material anxiety found in our contemporary experience of limit. First, I'll look at Kierkegaard's existential exploration of anxiety as a self that is becoming herself. Then I'll use the philosophical and religious language that Kierkegaard uses to engage with Paul's theological exploration of nature's anxiety in relation to human self-becoming. I'll suggest that the anxiety found in the encounter of nature's limits reflects the paradoxical encounter of limit and limitlessness in existential becoming. Part 1. Kierkegaard and existential self-becoming and anxiety. Human existence is, to summarize the Danish existentialist Kierkegaard, an entangled sort of freedom. It's an engagement with becoming oneself. However, contrary to defining this self as isolated ego, the self here is relational. Being human involves becoming oneself in relation. Understanding how it is to be human sheds light on different normative ways that we act this out. Kierkegaard offers a particularly nuanced account of this through engaging with the human experience in its lived existential complexity. He probes the human experience through writing in a diversity of styles and pseudonyms. For Kierkegaard, understanding who we are means looking at how we freely choose who we are. He acknowledges that there are different ways of doing this, but that this choice is part of being human. Kierkegaard writes pseudonymously that, quote, every human being is primitively intended to be a self from sickness. And John Davenport interprets this underlying human experience as, quote, a capacity for determined resolve that unites the agent's energies, involving alternative possibilities, but also a positive control over her plans, purposes, and even final ends, end quote. For Kierkegaard, the human experience involves choosing, which means that we also have the freedom to choose, even when it's complicated. Who we are involves the choices about whom we are choosing to become. Existence is actively committed to, then, and engaged by the individual in question. It is a, quote, subjective activity and personal assimilation and transformation of experience, end quote, from Collins. The outworking of this is often unseen, however, and a task that takes a lifetime to accomplish. For instance, in Crumbs, he writes that self-knowledge actually makes a person become confused about himself. This confusion is not a material confusion about a person's body, so much as an existential confusion of how we relate to ourselves and the world around us. Now, because this relation involves many different relational aspects, it requires different language to understand itself. For instance, Kierkegaard uses religious language to explain this choosing, where instead of self-knowledge, a self receives sin consciousness. Kierkegaard therefore uses religious but also psychological language to engage with the existential task of becoming an individual. This is particularly obvious in sickness through the experience of despair, and further in anxiety, where Kierkegaard's pseudonym Hoffmanensis develops the concept of subjectivity through the experience of freedom and anxiety. At the beginning of sickness, Kierkegaard's pseudonym suggests that the human being becomes an individual through self-choice. He writes, quote, a human being is a synthesis of the infinite and the finite, of the temporal and eternal, of freedom and necessity. In short, a synthesis. A synthesis is a relation between two. Considered in this way, a human being is still not a self. Rather than being presented ontologically through terms of being, the subject is constantly becoming. The I am seems to be more recognition of potentiality than actuality, uncovered through the interweaving of texts and the personal engagement with the process of choosing subjectivity. It is within the process of moving from potential to actual existence that the subject becomes an individual. However, this potential expression of subjectivity grounds the subject in a relation to the other. The human, quote, the human self is a relation that relates itself to itself, and in relating itself to itself, relates it to another. This subjective relation takes place coram Deo, before God, which also means before the infinite. This God term is the infinite other that makes possible our self-becoming. Each person has the choice presented to her as a result of being human. The choice exists for each, preconditions as a self, but each person is also free to choose it. In the concept of anxiety, the subject chooses the relation to the eternal. Resting in that choice dissipates the experience of anxiety. Anxiety, psychologically understood, reveals the, quote, restless repose, end quote, of the self before the infinite. Hoffniensis' new science shows how it points to a human experience as the struggle of possibility revealed in the life of the individual. Anxiety indicates the emergence of subjectivity and reveals what it means for humans to exist in a genuine or authentic sense, relating toward the self and outwardly toward others. Hoffniensis explains that he needs to use different kinds of language to articulate the human adventure. He's not concerned with specific classifications of anxiety as an isolated state of mind, but rather with what anxiety reveals about being human. It is an exercise in understanding. Hoffniensis suggests that the synthesis of subjectivity can be understood through the concept of anxiety. He claims that, quote, whoever has learned to be anxious in the right way has learned the ultimate. It applies to all humans. Quote, this is an adventure that every human being must go through, end quote. But it is experienced individually. This is because a person is individuum, and as such, simultaneously themselves and the whole race, and in such a way participates in the individual and the whole race from anxiety. Hoffniensis illustrates this paradoxical concept through the religious language of creation and the character of Adam. Adam is the first human that is created and exists individually as himself, while also being the origin, with Eve, of the whole human race. It seems that he means here that Adam is both himself and the race. What would follow is that our understanding of Adam would then also explain human experience more generally. Because the human race is generated from Adam and Eve, he writes that it is possible that, quote, what happened to one individual can happen to all, end quote. The individual is always responsible for her own choices, and the subject must choose for herself. So anxiety and the possibility of mischoosing enters human history through this first choice. Sylvia Walsh explains this phenomenon as, quote, a misrelation to oneself and to God that results from a person's unwillingness to become a self, end quote. Anxiety is thereby understood as a qualitative misrelation of subjectivity, one that's experienced as suffering. Thus, the qualitative change is developed through the inwardness of subjectivity. A qualitative change involves the spirit and can therefore be unseen. Ferreira suggests that a qualitative change happens when a person engages with the paradox of subjectivity. It is not just a simple choice. It is more a combination of freely choosing who we are as infinite and finite, with a synthesis that comes from beyond us. The approved affirmation of subjectivity, what Kierkegaard understands to be the subject choosing itself, is therefore explained through the movement of anxiety. The subject is free and unfree, bound in time while engaged with the infinite. This paradox of anxiety, Groen writes, means that anxiety is both, quote, that from which one should free oneself, and at the same time, that which one has to go through to be free, end quote. Thus, the human being is both given as a subject and a self that is continuously confronted with the task of becoming herself. Laying hold of this freedom of self-choice is therefore not something rationally abstracted, or something that can just be willed into existence. It is worked out in relation. Kierkegaard thus uses anxiety to explore the human experience that emerges as the self chooses and thereby receives itself in resting in God. Part 2, the groaning creation and self-becoming. But it is not just human beings that are caught up in this relational self-becoming. This now, not yet language is paralleled in the non-anthropocentric account of relation between nature, humanity, and God. In the often cited religious language from the New Testament, Romans 8:9-22, the writer states, "The creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed." This is the New International Version. For the creation was subjected to frustration in hope that the creation itself would be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning, as in the pains of childbirth, right up to the present time. Douglas Moo suggests that most modern interpreters agree that creation in these verses refers to the non-human creation, that is, the non-human animal and natural environment that has its own relationality toward God. In the passage from Romans, there are two interesting parallels to Kierkegaard's own anxiety that seem to be anthropologically read into the narrative of the non-human. First, the anxiety of expectancy, and second, the freedom of a self becoming itself. We've previously seen that Kierkegaard's anxiety is framed in the context of an expected possibility related toward the infinite. As the self recognizes the possibility within her, anxiety increases, though not in a way that can be quantified. Does this mean that Kierkegaard is espousing a kind of giantistic account, where a self becomes itself as it realizes its material limitlessness? I would argue that part of Kierkegaard's emphasis on the qualitative tradition of an individual becoming herself cancels this possibility out. The giantism of large-scale consumption that Northcott warns of in the introduction seems far from Kierkegaard's account of a spiritual relation to the infinite that brings about an anxiety of being. But it is not, I would argue, far from Paul's account of nature's anxiety. Here, too, there seems to be a relational uncovering between the self and the infinite, groaning, quote, as in the pains of childbirth. Interestingly, here, Paul uses an anthropomorphic reference to creation, as if it experiences the relation to the infinite God in some way similar to the becoming of a human being. Climacus writes of the self-becoming process that it is, quote, free, non-volitional, qualitative transition, end quote, in which the individual, quote, becomes another man, not in the frivolous sense of becoming another individual of the same quality as before, but in the sense of becoming a man of a different quality, or we may call him a new creature. That's from Fragments. For Kierkegaard, what differentiates the ethical from the religious is the spirit relation. Ferreira writes that this experience is a, quote, eruption of inwardness, end quote, through a, quote, qualitative shift in perspective, end quote. The qualitative transition seems to affect how we see the world as well, because its outworking is love. Also, contrary to the ethical, the religious relation is an absurdity to the understanding, from Postscript. In Postscript, Climacus says that it's, quote, only in the inwardness of self-activity, end quote, which at the same time enables the individual to see this relationality everywhere. It is the pathos-filled actuality of suffering that consciously empties itself in fragments. This chosen relinquishment is made with passionate, decisive interest and is constituted by captivating yet free engagement. It is chosen freely. At the same time, it cannot be done through a person's own strength, so it is not the same as acts of willpower. In Repetition, Kierkegaard contrasts this self that chooses to become herself in her new creatureliness with the arbitrary choosing of herself in different possibilities. Whilst this does not speak of consumptive patterns directly, I think that this can give us an interesting context for understanding the challenges of the qualitative relations that might underlie it. He writes, quote, thus the individual becomes lost in his own possibility, discovering first one and then another possibility. But the potential of the individual does not simply want to be heard. It is not simply passing through like the weather. It is creative. Thus, it always wants to be seen. Interestingly, here, Kierkegaard shows that the creative wishes to reveal itself, that is, to be birthed into something. I think it's possible to draw on Kierkegaard's previous creaturely metaphors here to show the significance of this depiction. But this birthing reveals a unified selfhood, that is, a choosing of self that is self-consistent. This contrasts with the self that is, quote, lost in its own possibility, discovering first one and then the other. So, how might Kierkegaard be able to answer the challenges of current environmental issues through his existential philosophy of self. I've argued that it can only be referenced indirectly through his discourse on anxiety. Here the self becomes increasingly anxious as she discovers just who she is, both finite and infinite. How can we be both? This possibility therefore increases the anxiety of the self. But it is not the possibility itself that enables us to become an individual. It is the choosing of the self that is also received. What sets the other relation apart is love, rather than an ethical absolute, is that it is received through the existential task of faith. He writes that, quote, man's highest achievement is to let God be able to help him, from the journals. This is an actively chosen movement toward God or the infinite possibility. God is defined as being of, quote, open possibilities, not fixed finalities, from Mooney. And asking for God's help, then, the individual receives existence back, paradoxically delivered with new and surprising meaning. When understood in terms of ethics, the relation becomes love that is extended toward the other. That is, there's a consistent self-choosing in relation to the infinite that then enables a self-becoming to take place beyond the muscular willing and beyond task-oriented or seen action. In many of Kierkegaard's references, including works of love, he references the relational language of Paul. In the passage cited for Romans, Paul reveals that nature is itself caught up in the anxiety of this self-becoming. It would be too easy to state that a relationship to nature, in which nature is arbitrarily used as a means to our end or self-pleasure, reflects the aesthetic existence. Maybe it does. But what I find more interesting, and arguably more challenging, is what we can read between the lines. This ruptured relation between us and nature will not be fixed by external obligations to new ethical norms, though it may fulfill them. This ruptured relation actually reveals a rupture in the relational structure of our own self before the infinite that nature is caught up in. A recognition of this is not just something that we can fix with our goodwill. It is qualitatively experienced in faith. Thus, it requires the insight of a revelation and perhaps a grace that is received as we choose to become ourselves in true co-creatureliness as an extension of the work of love. Thank you to Anna.